Up to 1 o'clock now, we'll get started. I'd like to call the Governance and Priorities Committee meeting to order. Good afternoon and welcome. I'd like to first recognize that we are holding this meeting on the traditional territory of Conejo First Nations. Our clerk today is Ms. Sheila Gurry. If during the meeting any member of the gallery has a question regarding an agenda item, please write down your name and the agenda item on the question period sign-up sheet, which is right there. Everybody over there. And at the start of the question period, the chair will call those who have signed up to address council. Ms. Gurry, do we have any introduction of late items?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we do. For agenda item 5D2, we're adding a report, City of Nanaimo sidewalk clearing practice. We were going to be adding a delegation from Ms. Dorothy Houghton, but she's not able to attend, so we're removing that. And we're removing the delegation Wanda Thompson from agenda item 5D1, bylaw enforcement function, and adding her instead to agenda item 5D2, commercial properties and investment. And that's it, Chair.
Thank you. I'd entertain a motion now to accept the agenda as amended by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Thorpe. Any questions? All those in favor? Carried. Motion for the adoptions of minutes as circulated. Can we do them all together?
Yes.
That's okay. We have a motion to that effect. Councillor Bonner, seconded Councillor Martin. Any questions? Hearing none. All those in favor? Carried. Okay, reports. 5D, community wellness, livability, bylaw enforcement function. Mr. Lindsay, apparently you're going to be introducing it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, thank you for your time this afternoon. GPC was scheduled originally to look primarily at the issue of bylaw and specifically the bylaw services functions that we provide here at the city. You have a report that's attached in your agenda, and our manager of community safety, Mr. Dave LaBerge, has a PowerPoint presentation that he's going to walk council through that supports the report that's in your package.
Good afternoon, Chair and Council. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. I'd like to introduce Ms. Cheryl Kozerski, our Senior Bylaw Officer, who's going to join me today. Many of you probably know I've been with the city for about 14 months, and she's been here for 34 years, so I expect some good questions today, and she's the real bylaw resource in the room this afternoon. Try to move through this as quickly as possible. There are a number of things I'd like to share with you this afternoon regarding the organization of bylaw services. What I'm going to highlight are the three areas of function that we have, bylaws, parking, and the animal control services. What I want to do is touch on briefly some of the different points of our organization, the types of calls we do, how we do investigations, and kind of the diversity of enforcement responses available to the city. I'm going to switch over and just go very quickly to parking and talk a bit about our downtown parking infrastructure and on-street parking, and just share some of the facts of how we do the enforcement pieces. And finally, I'll finish off with the animal control services and what we're looking forward to in 2020. Really quickly, Bylaw Services has 14 full-time employees. That includes 3 clerks and 10 bylaw officers, and we also have a number of bylaw officers that work out of the detachment that actually don't report under my line, but a lot of the work they do is very significant to bylaw services overall in the community, so I'll spend some time talking about their service lines as well. We account for about 2% of the operational budget of the city. So when we look at the bylaw services, it evolves out of 3 work units. So the officers work out of 3 different sites, one being the SARC building where the main bylaw office is. We have a second building downtown, which is our Park and Services office, the CPSO. And thirdly, the two officers that work out of the RCMP detachment. With the recent reorganization of the city, we now report to the Development Services line. Previously, we were under the umbrella of Protective Services. And broadly, what we deal with is assistance of other city departments in the enforcement and compliance of their respective bylaws. This includes elements of both investigations and compliance. And there's also a significant role of matters of security and public safety around a lot of the realms of public disorder and homelessness, which I'm going to talk about at length later on. So I'm going to touch for a few minutes on each of the respective work sites and the work that the different folks do. As I mentioned, our main bylaw services are administered out of the SARC building. It's where my office is, along with our senior bylaw officer, Shaul Kazarski. We have 3 full-time bylaw officers and 2 clerks. One is the general stenographer clerk that we have, and the second one does all of our tickets and adjudications. Adjudications meaning that when we do enforcement actions, we can either take matters to court or we can take them before provincially appointed adjudicators to have findings on a lot of our municipal ticketing matters. I'll talk about the significance of that a bit later, but this is a significant cost-saving measure for the city. The SARC building is where all the bylaw calls for service are received. And we dispatch with our clerks out to the other enforcement units in the city from there as well. This office is manned from Monday to Friday, and the officers that work out of this building are the point of contact for all the other city departments. This is also where we conduct all the regulatory investigations citywide, and all of the security investigations like homelessness outside of the downtown core, which I'll elaborate on. This is also where all the council reports, legal opinions, and bylaw update work flow out of. I touched on the adjudication system that we have. We actually are a networked hub for adjudication, so we set up this system and we administer it on behalf of about 8 or 10 different other municipalities now, which is a benefit to us that it's by spreading the cost of the service out to other municipalities, it brings our overall cost of our legal matters down significantly. The last thing that we administer out of SARC is the nuisance abatement program, which deals with problem properties, most of the police, the drug houses that occur around the community. So this is a photo of the downtown Community Policing and Services office on Victoria Crescent. Kind of the genesis of this is somewhat significant. The RCMP had community policing offices for several decades downtown. This was previously sited on Wharf Street behind the Coast Hotel. Back in the Red Zone days that many of you may have heard of about 12 or 14 years ago, the area that was under greatest stress in the area was the Victoria Crescent area, and the city, with the consent of the RCMP, moved this office to Victoria Crescent to try to give a strong enforcement presence in the area of downtown that was most affected by the homelessness as it occurred at that time. So around 2008 or 2009, although it was a community policing office, we also added one bylaw officer down there so that we could have more joint work done between policing bylaws. We were looking at ambassador programs and have private security working out of there, kind of a one-stop service center for enforcement downtown. Within a couple of years, the RCMP kind of reshaped their programs, and the downtown office, which fell under the umbrella of community policing, they took those resources and put them into the schools and effectively left the city downtown without any policing resources. And this was about the time when the city brought parking enforcement in-house. It used to be done by contract, and about the same period, I think it was 2012 or 2013, they hired a second manager in bylaws, an assistant manager that just administered parking, and 4 parking patrol officers. And by the fact that we had the lease in the building downtown, this became vicariously the downtown parking enforcement office. Although in hiring these 4 officers, they gave them a bylaw role, so not only were they doing the park enforcement, but also bylaw and security investigations downtown, and with a real emphasis on focusing on the disorder downtown as it was at that time. So this became exclusively a parking office, and we continued to operate to this day at the sum of about $40,000 a year. All the calls that go to them are dispatched typically out of the office at SARC. And I can tell you that in early times, a lot of the work was focused exclusively on parking, but more and more as time has evolved, the officers down there are focusing on the security and homeless aspects of their duties as they occur. They also do all the general duty bylaw enforcement anywhere in the downtown area, and they also do parking patrol at the Brecken Boat Ramp and in around Vancouver Island University, specifically the Nick and Knack facilities. And they provide coverage, although we have more officers there 7 days a week. So we have at least 2 bylaw officers working through the weekend days as well. These officers are equipped with 2 pickup trucks and what we call an LPR vehicle, or a license plate recognition vehicle. This is significant because a great deal of the work is actually breaking down and removing all the accumulations of the homeless encampments. In the years that followed after this unit was created, the second manager, the parking manager job was eliminated, and the kind of continuity of a lot of that work just reverted to the bylaw manager with the support of a parking clerk that works out at the CPSO. So the third layer of bylaw enforcement we have around the city actually operates out of the police detachment. And these officers are actually called municipal enforcement officers. The genesis of this was in about 1995, or 24 years ago, when the north end of the city was developing. There were a lot of issues with commercial transport regulations. So big heavy trucks that were going in and out of construction sites, deviating off of truck routes, spreading dirt from construction sites out onto the roadways, and a lot of the dangerous goods that were being hauled through the city. These were all matters that weren't being addressed by the RCMP, and the idea at the time was they put 2 municipal enforcement officers and gave them specialized training in the weighing of vehicles and the inspection of dangerous goods, that they could work in unison with the RCMP, and that has been substantially their role for the last over 20 years. They do have a lot of other duties, one of which is all of the parking enforcement in the city outside of the downtown core, the areas that are covered by the officers at the CPSO. And that often causes some confusion because these folks administratively report to the managers at the police station, but in reality, operationally, the work falls under the purview of the work that I administer. So the complaints that come in, which are, as you know, numerous, typically come to my desk for a resolution. They also support the RCMP significantly with a number of matters like noise, animal control, giving support to special events, impounding of vehicles. There's a lot of moving parts they've supported the RCMP with. But a couple of issues that have arisen recently are is that after over 20 years, the RCMP just this year took away their access to police radios. They have no longer have the ability to communicate with the officers real time or speak to the dispatch center to tell them when they're stopping vehicles and doing checks, which is kind of a significant setback because it really takes away a lot of their efficacy and their safety and being able to perform these duties safely. And the second thing that came with that is they've also now lost access to the police record systems, that they can't maintain file queues and respond directly to bylaw calls that come in through the police station. So over time, the reason I've just taken a few minutes to explain these things is we have 3 silos of bylaw services in 3 different buildings, but the evolution of that are from things that have occurred over many decades. So that kind of goes back to what my role exactly is. As most of you know, I came to the city last year from the RCMP. The manager role had been vacant for many months, and there had been a quick succession of managers. So I now do the role of what previously used to be the bylaw services manager, the parking manager. But there was also kind of a third element that was introduced in my job description, and that was addressing public safety and disorder as it related to municipally. As council, you're all aware of the experiences of entanglement and downloading from higher levels of government. Well, these realities also occur operationally for us. We're finding that police, health and housing capacity is overtaxed, and a lot of the disorder that occurs on our streets really revert to the municipality, as we are the ones that own the property and the infrastructure, and we then vicariously end up owning a lot of these problems. And that's been probably in the last year the main focus of what my responsibilities have been, is trying to rewrite some of our bylaws so that they conform with court rulings that change the way that we can address these problems, and trying to coordinate city police responses to a lot of things like the ending of the tent city and the management of the sites that occurred around, and then just responding to the community and elected officials on public safety issues. It's probably the majority of what we do around here. Another big role that we do in bylaw services is actually do corporate security for our city facilities. And I can tell you, some days just trying to manage the disorder pieces that occur in around these buildings, people that are in our washrooms using drugs or sleeping in the doorways or interfering with our staff as they come and go. This is just a daily aspect of what bylaw services has to manage. So I want to kind of move into what we do and how we do it. Here's a real quick snapshot of what our call volumes look like from year to year. And I want to emphasize that this doesn't include the officers, the municipal enforcement officers that work out of the attachment. That's probably another 1,600 calls for a year. You can see that our numbers of calls don't really change significantly over years. They're creeping up steadily, but the number that I really want to point out to everybody is the number of homeless encampments going from 2015 100 to just shy of 400 last year, and we're well on the trajectory to have similar numbers this year. And what's significant about this is in 2015, response to homelessness used to be clearing a person out of a doorway, and that would be a quick 10 or 15 minute thing to manage. Today it's more apt to be a collection of 10 or 12 tents in a park. It might require 3 or 4 bylaw officers and 2 or 3 police officers, contractors, equipment, etc. A lot of these encampment calls take sometimes days or weeks to mitigate. And as I put over to the side, those are the point-in-time counts that were conducted in 2016 and 2018. We see that there's been a sharp escalation in our homeless numbers from 175 up to 318 in 2018, or I'm sorry, 335. And that was just prior to the tent city, which turned out to be the largest tent city in the history of BC. But if I break down those calls even a bit further, in 2018 we had over 2,400 calls. And when you look at our call listings, there's probably 750 of those or more that are actually directly or indirectly related to the disorder and matters that arise from homelessness. These are things like going through our parkades, and during the winter months, it's not unusual to have a dozen people taking shelter in our parks or in our parkades, staying warm. It escalates the number of crime calls that we get into these areas, the aggressive panhandling, even complaints of people openly using drugs on the street. You'd think that it would be by de facto a police call, but in reality the police don't respond to calls of that nature unless there's some other very aggressive behavior that's occurring. question's often asked, what kind of bylaws we enforce? And the answer is we either seek compliance or enforcement in any of the bylaws that the city has. These are the ones that we use most commonly. A lot of these are done through the other regulatory departments we have, our business licensing department, cannabis retail stores are a thing that we spend a great deal of time during that transition period ticketing and closing the unlicensed cannabis stores. These files can sometimes take a couple hours in the morning. Some of these files go on for years. A lot of the duties and investigations we do require inspection in properties. More and more we're finding that we have to obtain judicial authorization or entry warrants to get into these properties because people aren't willingly letting us into the premises. We're finding a lot of issues of environmentally and structurally unsafe houses that have caught in fire. We have to be able to get crews in to inspect them, determine their net worth, and just determine whether they should be remediated by removal. These things take a lot of time. They take a lot of outside resources, and they often result in litigation or injunctions or significant costs. The other piece that we do a lot of is nuisance abatement with the police, meaning managing drug houses in the community. These are a lot of numbers, but if we break it down from year to year, this will just give you a quick snapshot of the types of calls by category that we go to. You'll see kind of really big drops in some years in 2018. The reason being that as we try to drill down the true cost of things like homelessness, we create new subcategories, meaning rather than saying homelessness, we then break it down to calls about drug use, calls about soliciting, calls about sheltering in doorways, so that we can identify how we're breaking down our time of our officers. So a quick overview of how complaints are received, how we prioritize them, and how we investigate them. In general, what we try to do is give priority to matters of public safety, and that by default often tends to be the matters of encampments and open drug use. And reason being is that there's often immediate and lasting impacts on our downtown areas and our commercial areas. Imagine if you bring your young children down to the library and there's somebody openly using drugs in down at Crowell Plaza as you go there. That's not a priority call for the police, but events like that prevent citizens often from wanting to come back downtown again. So we put very high emphasis on those things. Similarly, every morning we do sweeps down the commercial streets and try to clear ostensible homelessness out of doorways, so people that are sheltering in doorways, so that people that are trying to open their businesses first thing in the morning aren't stepping over people and having to remove some of the accumulation of effects that occur. If we don't do these things, these problems tend to escalate very quickly when they're unmanaged. And a good example is a cleanup that we're going to be doing tomorrow. We have an encampment on some public lands, and checked this morning, there was probably 14 tents, and it's going to require substantial police presence to be able to safely decamp it. Been a lot of communication about ticketing and how we do enforcement, and on that point I want to talk for a few minutes about the issue of fairness. Our bylaw enforcement, or the decision not to enforce our bylaws, can have a lot of significant impacts on people. It impacts people's property values, quality of life in a neighborhood, and even the relationships among people. And anybody that's done enforcement for any period of time will know that if we're not cautious, we're often drawn into long-standing acrimonious conflicts between different parties. When we go to any one of these calls, we have to evaluate it from a number of perspectives. One is, what is the interest of the person that's making the complaint? And then second of all, how about the position of the person who's responding to it? And then third, is there a broader harm or broader interest to the rest of the community? A very simple question of that is, report of vegetation that had grown over a sidewalk, and we contacted the property owner to ask them to cut it back. And it was a elderly lady, and she said, I'm so sorry, my husband just died last week. I don't have the means to deal with this right now. And so this is one of those things that ends up taking 3 months instead of maybe the week or two turnaround people expect. There's a story behind all these things, and we always have to evaluate the interests of everybody. These aren't always as straightforward as they may think. Sometimes we find that it's just not possible in public interest to satisfy everybody's positions when there are long-standing and intractable differences. I'll just talk briefly about a few examples of what I've seen in the brief time I've been with the city. So one recent example, well, actually it happened here. One recent example I saw was a resident, our building department inspector, and found an illegal suite, and they were given an order to remove it. Faced with the loss of the revenue, the resident got very upset and then decided who the most likely culprit was in the neighborhood who reported. And we started getting a string of complaints that went back in that direction. Well, the shed that's been there for 20 years is too close to my property line, and the fence is too high, and now they're digging without checking for natural gas, and went on and on. And at a certain point, the respondents now, who actually were just sort of innocent bystanders, saying these complaints aren't made in good faith. I mean, these are retaliatory or seeking kind of revenge. And I see that manifest in a lot of things. We had another call recently where we asked somebody to remove some blackberries off the back of a property that was encroaching on the roadway, and the owners vehemently did not want to do the work to do it. And the question was, which one of my neighbors complain about it, because I want to complain because they have blackberries as well. And when the complaint process was explained to them, they did the work grudgingly after about a month, but then showed up a day later and presented a list of 40 properties they'd found around the city, saying, well, if we have to do it, then we want everybody else to do it. Again, this matter of not made in good faith. If you understand how the courts work, because a lot of our stuff, I'm going to talk about how things go in court, when things are trivial, which are not important, if they're frivolous, meaning that they're not reasonably purposeful, or if they're vexatious, meaning that they're based on improper motive, the courts and the judges do not look favorably on us, and we're not successful in those types of prosecutions. That's why we always have to balance all the interests. There's always backstories in all these files. I want to move on now and talk about the type of enforcement tools, the suite of tools that we do have to our avail. This goes from the far left of the continuum to the far right, meaning voluntary compliance. This is really from an enforcement perspective where we try to spend most of our time. When people do something, they build a fence that's too high, they make noise that disturbs their neighbors, whatever the case may be, we bring it to their attention, here's the expectations, here's what the law is. The majority of people want to live in this area. The further over we go, the more formal the processes are, and typically the more intractable the differences are that in the neighborhood. If we suddenly go to court and we pitch one neighbor against the other, we might resolve the issue of a barking dog, but then there's long-standing animosity. These things can get really expensive when we start moving into the further to the right. If we go past file fence notices, which are all adjudicated by our system before adjudicators, anything further to the right it plays out in court, and we have to hire private lawyers to do the prosecutions, either in provincial or in Supreme Court, where we get injunctions. There's a time and place to spend a lot of money on injunctions. They're very expensive and they're slow, but sometimes it's inevitable because that's the only way we can get lasting and enduring results. And we've seen some of those things, like when we're trying to close down a tent city or situations like that. I want to talk briefly about what those costs might look like. A few recent examples. Court injunctions, they easily go up over $100,000, and this is just the raw cost of our lawyers. It doesn't talk about the time of our staff to prepare affidavits, to testify in court, and all the other background work that's involved in there. Second example is a matter that we're dealing with right now in provincial court. When I came here 14 months ago, we'd seized a dog that bit 3 people, a child, a animal trainer, and a social worker. And we've been caring for that dog since that time. We've been to courts and brought in experts repeatedly. That legal bill is currently at over $30,000, and we still are waiting for continuations on that. So the costs of these things are enormous. I always refer to the barking dog. This was another local government on the island recently brought a private prosecutor in to prosecute a $100 barking dog ticket, and their legal bill was $18,000, and they weren't successful. That's the reality of bringing these things into court sometimes. We have another matter, a zoning matter that we're privately prosecuting at the moment. We're not going to trial until the end of next month, and our legal bill on that is already around $13,000. So, you know, when we talk about enforcement, we talk about ticketing, there's a time and a place for it, but it's not always the panacea, and it's not the revenue generator that's always thought to be. In actual fact, this can end up costing the city a great deal of money if we don't do it in a very measured and thoughtful way. I want to talk about Penticton for a moment. I think most of council was at a recent meeting at the Capri Theatre, and a lot of the community asked, why aren't we more like Penticton? They have great bylaws and they have great responses to the issues of disorder and homelessness, and I was a bit puzzled because I had looked at their bylaws, and when I went back and read through them, in actual fact, they have a lot of the same bylaws we do. They just consolidated into one, and we've spread ours out. The best example I saw, you know, with the homeless issue they have there, which isn't as significant as ours, is they decided to do a private prosecution in the provincial court of this fellow. They charged him 8 times for aggressively panhandling in a site. Private lawyers came in. They actually negotiated a plea agreement prior to going to trial. So this thing actually didn't go to a trial. And they agreed to a $145 fine and a requirement that he comply with the bylaw and not solicit within 100 meters of where he'd been doing it. So essentially, instead of soliciting in front of the Flying Fish, he could go down to Sears Coffee. It turns out he didn't pay the fine or comply with any of the conditions of the agreement. So now they're bringing him back to court in November, and the cost of that trial now for the city of Penticton is in excess of $30,000. And what this did in the process was drew the ire and attention of the BC Civil Liberties Association, and basically they were saying, shame on this community, you're bullying people, and I just want to understand that things aren't always what they seem to be looking into them. We want to talk about nuisance, and we could really take apart any of the bylaws that we enforce and talk about the nuances of them, but one that you've heard a lot of in the last year is acceptable nuisances, and what relates to noise. As our community's grown, a lot of our subdivisions have grown around activities that have occurred for decades. Industrial sites, sawmills, recycling centers, gun ranges, animal kennels, and at a certain point, they'll come converging, and I've heard phone calls on every one of these folks. You know, I live downtown, and I don't enjoy the music from the festivals that are Matthew Sutton Park. I don't like the sound of people that are talking outside of the nightclubs, or the periodic sound of music as the door opens and closes. And the question always comes back is, what is an acceptable level of nuisance? What activity has been there for decades, and what has changed? And often the answer is nothing is substantially changed, but people's tolerances, expectations are very, very different. And you know, going back to my example of a barking dog, how much barking from a dog is unreasonable? It might cost you $18,000 to find the answers of those things. But the important thing to understand is these issues really can cause bitter disputes that are complex. They go on for years. Some cases, we take them as far as court injunctions to try and get some resolutions. You hear as a council a lot of these kind of complaints. And our response has to be very measured and very thoughtful in these matters. So the question is, what are the best practices that are out of there? You know, the first thing we always do is we look to other communities and how they do business and why they do it those ways. And I can tell you, I policed all over the province, and every community is very unique from the history and from the politics and the problems that they've dealt with in the past. And I can tell you size does matter. The bigger the community, the more complex the issues, but also the more resources that the community often has and the types of specialization. Big cities have lawyers on staff. Each one of their regulatory departments have people that are specially trained to deal with the issues that kind of arise. And so we kind of look around and we look at the numbers of how many bylaws there have, where we find that, you know, there isn't a lot of consistency between the communities and their approaches. We find that small communities don't have a lot of money, tend to be very risk adverse. They don't want to spend a lot of money on prosecution. And some of the larger cities tend to do things that are more aggressive than we would, the type of risk we'd be prepared to take on. Another matter is the type of relationship that you have with the police. We happen to be in a very good position in Nanaimo that we work very closely with the police. But the reality is, as they get busier and busier, there's an ever-widening gulf of the types of calls they should be doing, but in actual fact, what our bylaw officers are dealing with. And the final piece, of course, is the service delivery models vary from city to city. Some cities may have 10 bylaw officers, but they also do animal control in-house or parking. There's a lot of hybrid models, and it's very different. I've talked a lot about homelessness, and I really want to emphasize this because I've said it a number of times. This is really the majority of the work that the bylaw department is doing these days. I've asked anecdotally my officers how much time they spend, and they say up to 70% of their time responding to the impacts of homelessness. As I said, this often involves large established camps. If you think of the volume of garbage the tons of garbage that was removed out of Tent City with 200 to 250 inhabitants each week by our sanitation department, and now look at the sprawl of homelessness throughout the city that's unchecked, you can just imagine just the scope and demand on city services, not just bylaws, but our sanitation and parks and trying to keep our streets and our parks clear. The photograph you see there was provided by the Canadian Mental Health Association. They have a 4-person outreach team, and they've just used some geotagging to put pin map, geo-tracking of where they found encampments over the last about 6 to 9 months. And really what that illustrates is, whereas 10 years ago homelessness was downtown, it's now widely sprawled throughout the city. Really any green space or open spaces in the city at some point or another has a homeless presence in it. I can tell you that my officers have become vicarious sanitation workers. I mentioned earlier that the officers downtown have 2 trucks, and that's not by accident. Each of those officers take up to 4 truckloads of garbage to our Public Works Department every day. And that's not a slight on our sanitation department, but the public doesn't expect that when city trucks go up and down the street that you drive past things because it's somebody else's responsibility. They grab and go things as they see it. We don't leave garbage, and we don't leave detritus in front of businesses and public parks. And so a lot of this is vicariously falls on these officers who are in these areas frontline all the time. We're right now trying to assess what those actual costs are besides man hours, and I can tell you just the tipping fees, what we handle hauling it to Public Works and then taking it to the dump. I think I heard numbers of $50,000 or $60,000 in added tipping fees that just from that alone. Add to that, there are so many nuances to this. We're finding more and more people that are living in their vehicles in our parks and in our facilities, in RVs. A big thing lately have been derelict RVs that can't be driven up the road. Sometimes don't have drivetrains. They get parked on the side of the road and people live in them. And it's really tough because under our bylaws, our contractor has to take it to their storage yard, keep it for 30 days and store it, and then we have to have the septics pumped out and then have it pulled apart. And disposal and storage costs $1,500, $2,000 a vehicle. In the meantime, these vehicles are often occupied by handicapped senior people that were otherwise putting out in the street. So there's the cost and their displacement factor. These used to be one-offs, but we're dealing with a couple of these a month right now, and it's causing a lot of hardship on our contractor. The other thing I really want to emphasize is this isn't the job that bylaw officers signed up to do. These are photographs taken by my officers, not by the police. These are what they come up against when they're clearing out these encampments. I can tell you I was a cop for over 3 decades, and the context in the street is deteriorating very steadily in recent years because of the nature of the drugs that are on the street, the sheer number of homelessness, and just the humanitarian crisis and conditions that people are out there. And the violence and the weapons are just a very regular part of that context now. I can tell you that the incidence of assaults on my officers is rising steadily. It's resulting in workplace injuries, long-term impacts where I have people away on long-term leave. Some days I only have 1 or 2 and sometimes no officers that are actually available to go out on calls because of injuries and leave times. This leaves us with some other difficult things we have to contemplate. We now arm our officers with aerosols and vests and batons, which many municipalities do. It's just not an area of liability that we readily want to move into, but we're forced to by the conditions that they're experiencing out there. I kind of want to wrap up then, just talking about, so what is the role of council in all this? From our perspective, it's to enact the bylaws and provide direction as to what the enforcement priorities are. It's important to leave the responsibilities of how we enforce and investigate these bylaws, these decisions to staff. I can certainly say with great respect that it's been our experience that this council very well understands the respective roles, which is appreciated. There is always a lot of call for new bylaws, and an example was brought up at the town hall meeting. What about something that limits the distribution of harm reduction supplies? This is a provincial health jurisdiction. We never want to recommend solutions that seem expedient, but they actually push against the jurisdiction of higher levels of government. The second thing that I've touched on is when we consider new bylaws, are they equitable? And another one that comes up all the time are shopping cart bylaws. We actually drafted one, we're ready to present it. We saw when other communities like Vernon and Kelowna were ready to enact them, and there was such pushback from interest groups like the BC Civil Liberties Association as they backed off and abandoned it. And the last thing is, when we consider enforcement priorities, do we have the staff and the equipment and resource capacity to manage these things? As you see, we're very taxed right now dealing with matters that we weren't dealing with a decade ago. Mr. Rudolph, I didn't have my presentation. Did you want me to talk about graffiti for a few minutes?
Sure, yeah.
Mr. LaBerge, before we proceed, I believe Councillor Martin has a question.
I can wait until it's
You sure?
finished.
Okay. Carry on then. Thank you.
I don't have a slide. Mr. Rudolph asked late last week if I could just talk for a few minutes about graffiti because it's been a significant problem. I can tell you briefly, my understanding is that in 2004, the City of Nanaimo created a graffiti task force at the direction of council. It was a big problem then as it is today. That task force was led by the Public Works and Parks operation, and it had a number of actions. It removed and covered up graffiti tags really quickly. It had a program and policy of adding anti-graffiti coatings to all of our city signage and new construction like our conference center. This enables us to remove it very quickly and cost effectively. The police were really involved, which they aren't today. We had a good database where we used to geo-track all the tags, and we know we could assign or identify which tagger was responsible for each one and how many of them we were finding around the city. didn't get a lot of traction, simply that we all know that in a single night, one tagger can go out and put 150 marks around the city, which costs a great deal of money to clean up. And the idea was that we could go to court, say, well, they didn't just do this tag we caught them doing, but they actually did 300 around the community. The reality is that the courts say that it's not like a handwriting analysis to say you can't prove definitively that although that tag shows up repeatedly throughout the community, that it was that person. So these tend to be kind of one-off types of attempts. So a lot of the efforts now are around prevention. We commissioned murals to be painted on some buildings. The traffic boxes and infrastructure were graffiti wrapped and coated. The business association, as it then was downtown, created a small fund to help folks that were constantly inundated with graffiti, and the only requirement to get funding from them was to have police do CPTED evaluations on how maybe they could remove their risk of exposure. And then we did annual cleanups led by the city annually that were volunteer driven. We were so successful at this for a number of years that by 2013 we actually hosted the Canadian Tags Conference. But a lot of things have changed in about the last 6 years, and a lot of the folks that led these initiatives aren't with the city or with the RCMP anymore, and we're to a point where the city's getting hit hard. We've come back and tried to address it by, we've changed the fine structure in our bylaws from a $100 fine now up to $500, which is the maximum under our adjudication system, and we're really trying to engage the companies that control a lot of the infrastructure. And that's really tough. BC Hydro has a policy that they're only going to remove tags from the infrastructure if it has hate, racist, or offensive writings on it. In the past, they've donated money to help us contract removal. They haven't been as engaging in recent times. TELUS has been very proactive. They contract removal services, and they're actively using wraps and graffiti, quoting with their infrastructure. The last two, Shaw Cable and Canada Post, we've reached out to them repeatedly. Their local representatives aren't getting back to us, and we're not really getting any traction on cleaning their infrastructure up. This is a really tough one. A single tagger can put literally hundreds of marks around the town. And what we tend to do with private property is under our property maintenance bylaw, we send letters and require owners, buildings to remove the graffiti within 21 days, or we do it at their expense. Often these cleanups are $500 to $1,000 a time, and the buildings are tagged again within a week of the removal, and so we get a lot of frustration and a lot of pushback. It's very understanding. It's very frustrating for everybody. In the courts, we just don't seem to get a lot of traction. Some cities have tried actually suing individuals. Nobody's really found a lasting way to respond to that. I'm going to move on next to parking and animal control. I wanted me to stop and take some questions first.
I think if you would mind, Mr. Burris, I've got Councilor Martin, Hemmons, and Bonner.
Thank you, through the chair, and thank you for all the work you do and everybody that works in this department, because it's astronomical, right? And this is a huge focus for our city. And I don't know if you can answer this question off the top of your head, but do you know how many, what the average city our size in comparison has for the number of bylaw officers they have?
Through the chair, thank you for that question, because I tasked Cheryl last week to do that research, and I looked at half a dozen cities that are of comparable population. So with Nanaimo, with 98,000 people, we have 6 that do parking. And I should add, when I say 6, we had 4 until this summer, and we've just brought 2 online. So we're just starting to realize that. And 3 bylaw officers and a senior officer. Chilliwack with 90,000 has 2 managers and 6 bylaw officers. Kamloops with 97,000 people has a manager, and then 2 teams of 6 bylaw officers each. Each team having a supervisor and 6 parking officers in addition. Maple Ridge at 88,000 has 1 manager 7 bylaw enforcement officers, and 1 parking officer. Delta at 109,000 has a manager, 12 bylaw officers with 3 supervisors, and then 3 auxiliary officers and 4 seasonal officers during the summer months. Kelowna at 136,000 people has 1 manager, 2 supervisors, 2 senior officers, and 18 bylaw officers. 4 of the officers are exclusively tasked to dealing with transient issues such as homeless encampments. Their parking services are entirely separate from that. And lastly, Victoria with 92,000 people, 1 manager, 1 senior officer, and 7 bylaw officers. That doesn't include things like parking function either.
Great, thank you.
And Councillor Hemmings.
Thank you. Through you to Mr. Labarge. Thank you for your presentation. This is specific to graffiti. I'm curious if the city's ever explored a work program for those who face barriers to employment. On tonight's Committee of the Whole agenda, we have a presentation from the Community Action Initiative looking at a peer-run skills and employment program. We know these are models that can work, and we know with graffiti in particular, it can be very helpful. So has the city ever explored a program like that?
So through the chair to Councillor Hemmings, yes, we have, and we actually tried it as a pilot through some restorative justice. And the challenge we have is that when you're on public infrastructure, going to private property, you have to have supervision. So invariably, it ended up being our bylaw officers that were taking the folks out, and then there was the liability issues of the work being performed in certain environments. And what they really concluded was that where there might have been a lesson to the person doing the work service, the actual time and cost to the city made it impractical.
Thank you.
And Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Mr. LaBerge. Quite a few questions. In terms of the amount of time you're saying we're spending on homelessness, and sometimes up to 75% of the time, it would seem to me then that we're spending less time on parking and various other things and more time on homelessness. Do you have a plan to ask for an increase of staff in your business plan so that we can allocate more people to this situation, which isn't going away and just getting worse, so that we have more people to concentrate on the parking enforcements and all that other sort of stuff that goes on in the city?
Yes, thank you. Through the chair to Councillor Bonner.
It's hard, isn't it? It's hard. I did that all.
As I said, I received 2 new positions, one that came online in May and one that just started this fall. I really haven't been able to assess the efficacy and what the impacts were, and I thought it would be disingenuous in 2020, although I think there's plenty of work that I could use more staff, that I could ask for more bodies until I could demonstrate the results of productivity of the increases that I received this year. But yes, looking forward, I don't see that things are going to improve.
Well, and the reason I'm asking is I think, if I remember correctly, those 2 were specifically for parking. So if you're pulling them off for something else, then maybe we should look at getting more people to do that job as opposed to the parking one.
Yes.
So I'd hope to see that coming up forward. In terms of the 2 that are working with the RCMP, since their services have pretty well been cut, would it be, are we looking at the possibility of just pulling them out of there, freeing up a couple spaces for the RCMP? We're always complaining about lack of space, and just running them out of City Hall.
Through the chair, that would be an excellent idea. That's not a decision for me to make. I can tell you as the manager, I find it very difficult and inefficient to manage 3 groups of people out of 3 different buildings that don't communicate and they're dispatched out of one area. Ideally, I think everybody should be working out of one building so we could then change there's also 3 job descriptions. I'd like to see 1 broad job description so that we could cross-train and capitalize on the synergy of all of these resources. So yes, it would make a great deal of sense. And I can also say that the 2 additional parking officers I received. I didn't have room for them at the downtown community office, so in fact, they work out of SARC now because we didn't have desks and network capabilities for them, so that unit is further fragmented at this moment.
Okay. Back to page 5 on call volumes. You spent a fair amount of time talking about graffiti, but I'm looking at the call volumes for graffiti, and they're down almost 35% since 2016. And having done a random walk around town and driving around town, most of the graffiti that I'm seeing is on electrical boxes, that sort of thing. When we were at UBCM, I was talking with both BC Hydro and TELUS, and they have programs that they will partner up with the city to wrap them. I think that perhaps our time might be better spent, or money's better spent just paying for the wraps every time one gets tagged, as opposed to maybe making a whole committee to work on that. But that's just a suggestion. But I'm not seeing that as it looks like it's actually decreasing in call volumes. And speaking of call volumes, do you include email complaints in your call volumes?
So, through the chair, I agree with your comments, yes. The scope of the graffiti problem and how many complaints we get about it may not necessarily be correlated. Often we find areas that are hit over and over. There tends to be an element of fatigue where people just simply stop calling. And I want to make it clear that yes, it makes a lot more sense to treat the surfaces and minimize the cost of cleaning it up. These are things that invariably have been led historically by our roads and Parks Department, who tend to suffer all the impacts. It hasn't, the solutions haven't necessarily been enforcement driven.
Well, and I'm thinking that if council passed in the budget and gave you like $40,000 or something like that, and every time you saw one of them tagged, you could just call up the print company and they'd wrap it the next day. And as you just said, I would look, by all means, feel free to put that in a business plan coming forward, because I'd be very much in favor of that. Are you allowed to re-ticket? Like if you come up to a situation, and let's go back to the vegetation thing, where vegetation's growing across the sidewalk, you ask the business or the homeowner to remove it, they don't, you issue them a ticket. Do you give them a certain amount of time, and then can you give them another ticket?
Through the chair, yes, we could treat every day as a separate offense. I can tell you with things like vegetation removal, it doesn't always happen as quick as people would like it because individual circumstances sometimes take more time. But my experience is that our compliance rates are at almost 100%. People do it, they just don't necessarily do it very quickly all the time. So we are insistent and we expect it to be done. I think maybe the question is it fast enough to everybody's satisfaction?
Mr. Sims?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I can speak a little bit to this because our transportation group gets involved often in this as well. And our focus is fixing the problem, really, which might be a tree overhanging a sidewalk or a road or creating visibility issues. And typically we would issue them a letter, and if nothing happens within a short period of time, then we'll go and remove the vegetation ourselves. So that's typically how we would respond. It depends on whose lap it lands in, and oftentimes we work together with Mr. LaVerge's group on that.
Okay, thank you. We're done. So, do we get a lot of, like going back to the vegetation on sidewalks and stuff like that, do you get a lot of, my husband died last week and I'm not able to do this, or are typically these on more commercial properties where I'm seeing most of them?
Through the chair, I'm the manager, so I don't necessarily see the day-to-day calls. The ones that have been brought to my attention tend to be, a cyclist that goes the same route every day and will give us a list of 8 or 10 calls. We send it to an officer, and usually they go down the street and send letters and notify each household, and some of them do it right away. And the feedback I've got from the officers are sometimes they're just really big jobs. There's 100 feet on a 15-foot high hedge, and people have busy lives, and it seldom is it we're not going to do. It's just it's going to take us a bit of time. And I think where the frustration comes in, I mean, we're in with our climate, we're coming back to the same properties every year or 18 months because they cut it back to the property line, and things like blackberries, sometimes we're back 6 weeks later.
I have one more in terms of
Can you
rules.
hold that for, because I've got a speaking list of 4 others. So.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. So next we have Councillor Brown, followed by Councillor Hemmons and Councillor Armstrong.
Yes, thank you, Chair Turley. I think I'll just ask my question now because I'm not sure if it fits so much into parking. And I echo Councillor Martin's earlier comments that a few years ago did a ride along with a bylaw officer in different jurisdictions, and it was a very wild day. And that wasn't you, and I think what it must be like the compounding problems of homelessness and addictions that we are facing here. I appreciate the overview. I think it's important for us to have an understanding of this. I'm curious though, the motion really speaks to the breakdown of annual enforcement budget and revenues and how this compares with other similar municipalities. Is that information coming?
Through the chair, yes, thank you. Good question. We sent the request out, and the information is coming back piecemeal, meaning people can quickly tell us what their resources are, but as far as budgets, we'll get back to you because we have to ask the questions. So when I have it compiled, I will try to put it in a report to your attention.
Right, thank you. The reason I ask is I think that information is important for 2 reasons as we go into budgeting. Like Councillor Bonner sort of highlighted, I noticed in the prepared business case that it doesn't look like there's any staffing changes. And sort of touching upon how difficult of a job I think it is, if there is issues related to folks taking time off for a variety of reasons, how best to support and enable those folks to do that work attached with homelessness, because I think it's probably extremely trying and difficult. So how do we help both those frontline folks? And then from a different perspective, if we are looking at service changes, how to, I think that information is important to know, sort of how we're comparing from a general bylaw enforcement policy or philosophy perspective, however you want to touch upon it. So I understand there is a currently implemented and probably adopted policy that might not be official, but it's sort of been, how things have been done. But if council were to change that, I think some of this information is important for making a decision one way or the other. So I appreciate the information today, but I actually don't feel like in a position to really comment too much on it until that information is prepared. Thank you.
Okay, next we have Councillor Hemmons, followed by Councillor Armstrong, Councillor Bonner for 1, and Councillor Krog and Councillor Thorpe.
Mayor Crowe. Mayor.
Mayor Krog, sorry. I demoted him.
Didn't lie.
Thank you, Chair. My comments actually follow very closely to Councillor Brown's. Great presentation. Good to see the work that's taking place. I'm interested that we have parking bylaw, but 70% of what they do is dealing with homeless encampments, et cetera, just kind of seeing the evolution of what our bylaw department deals with is interesting. I too was just missing that kind of tangible quality of how much are we bringing in versus how much is going out. And I think, if I may be so bold, I think the elephant in the room is that is there an opportunity for revenue generation with our bylaw department that we're missing? And I'm hearing you say that you've requested some information and it will be coming to us, but if you have any quick comments in your search of other jurisdictions, it sounds like everyone does this a little bit differently, which I think is probably pretty normal. From a leadership standpoint, I'm curious, are we missing something or not?
Through the chair, those are excellent questions. One of the main points that I want to emphasize with ticketing and fines what we write and what we collect are often two very different things. With provincial tickets, if the fines are unpaid, they go onto you don't get to renew your driver's license or your vehicle insurance. If a ticket's written to an individual, we don't have the same tools to recover unpaid fines, short of sending debts to collection agency or initiating small claims actions, which we wouldn't do unless there was a significant accumulation. So what you write and what you collect are often two different realities. As far as the ticketing, I don't want to underemphasize the fact that when I read the Ombudsman's reports on bylaw services in general, the emphasis is on compliance, explaining rules, educating people, and getting them to conform. Most of the work that my officers do is to go out, tell people where they've gone wrong, and please correct it. And the majority of people do exactly that. The thing about ticketing, if you want to look at every problem as a nail and your only tool is a hammer, then that's a blunt way of managing a community. And I can tell you, going back to the example of downtown, we started to pick up our ticketing enforcement, our parking downtown, and the feedback I'm steadily getting from merchants down there is, why us again? I mean, we're the only ones that have the paid parking, we're the ones that have all the homelessness and all the services and everything else. And now, as soon as I get a few customers in, they're all coming in with tickets saying they're not going to come back. And you can always put more of an emphasis on writing tickets, but my experience is that you're going to pay for it in so many other subtle ways on the how it treats your constituents and whether it actually improves conditions or, as I say, burdens the gulf between people that are already having intractable differences. So I don't know that more ticketing revenue is always the panacea that we sometimes believe it could be.
Quickly, yes.
Okay, thank you for that. I agree with you. And I just want to highlight something from your presentation that I didn't hear you touch on, but when I was reading the agenda, it really stood out to me, and that's that it's on the slide, importance of fairness and impartiality. And you note that many complaints are about a perceived failure of the city to enforce a bylaw in response to a complaint. So what I'm hearing that is saying that you're dealing with bylaws and infractions, et cetera, but you're also dealing with how people feel about how you're managing that file. And that stood out to me as an important piece of the conversation.
Through the chair, yes, and probably a perfect example to illustrate what I mean by that. We had a matter that came to the attention of council some time ago where a house was being renovated and fixtures and appliances were being left outside. It generated complaints from the neighborhood, and an officer attended, went through the house, and the house was completely gutted out. In fact, there was a full renovation underway, and the conversation went along the lines of, we get it, you're renovating, there's going to be a bit of a mess. It's upset in the neighborhood. Would it be possible in the interim, during the course of this renovation, that you could move all of this stuff that you're moving in or out into your backyard? Because it had a really high fence around the whole property. They complied with that, and then a couple of weeks later, a complaint came to council complete with photographs, and it was from a resident who lived across the street who'd actually gotten the permission of the neighbor next door, gone in the back, climbed over the fence, and took pictures down into the yard of items that were stacked out of view of their residence. And and really, we went back and re-inspected when the further complaints came in and said, well, that's part of living. You're renovating your house, you're storing your things, you're doing it out of sight, you've done everything that we can ask. And it's just one of the type of example where people, in their views, say that we're not enforcing the bylaws. And in fact, the bylaw is being complied with, and it's just a matter of very different perspectives.
Okay, so next we have Councillor Armstrong, followed with Councillor Bonner.
I would urge all council to read the BC Auctioneering report on that, and I'll just read you one fast line where it says that while council sets policy and provides general direction on enforcement priorities, its individual members should not become directly involved in enforcement action by directing enforcement against specific residents, groups, or businesses, or by directed enforcement action not occur in a particular circumstance. Individual enforcement action should be made by delegated bylaw enforcement staff or contractors, and that's right from the Ombudsman report. Our role is to set the policy and then remove ourselves. So I would really encourage people to read that. It's a really important report. A lot of the situations we find ourselves in, it goes to the Ombudsman, and we're not going to be successful. And I echo, having done 36 years of policing as well, you take a look at small communities, you will never write a traffic ticket, ever. You bring in other police officers to do that because you will not survive in that community. Your life will be hell, you will not get backup, you will not get support. So it's a balancing act, and I really think we have to remember that not only are they writing tickets, they've got other duties, and they were hired for a reason, and discretion is one of them. And if you look at not only that, you even look at the BC government website, everything is about trying to get compliance. It's not about ticketing. And to use tickets for revenue is highly frowned upon. So I think that's something we really need to think about when we look at this. And like I said, I really encourage you to there's a role of council section right in there. And I know, again, I want to echo the work that's been done, because I know, having worked with their group as well, and having been part of the graffiti task force when it was extremely successful, we didn't have the graffiti that we're seeing now. And for those that don't think it's not costly, it is. Just go ask Archie Johnson how much money he spent over the years cleaning up graffiti. It's in the tens of thousands. Langford actually had a case where they went after the parents and were successful for $300,000 in damage. It's a lot of damage. It's not young kids that are doing this. It's old, it's criminal behavior, and they're tagging all over. So really important to think about. And when it comes to the wrapping, we have to remember that's private property, so we have to get permission from the people, and it's a lot of money as well to wrap. So anyhow, I just wanted to thank you, and just wanted to echo that, we have to be really careful what our role is. It's not to be involved in the enforcement of things. It's to set the policies and then let them deal with that. Thanks.
Okay, next we have Councillor Bonner, followed by Mayor Crowe, and then Councillor Thorpe, and then Councillor Marks.
Thank you. Going back to page 11 so far in your report, it's the role of council. Second line says, determine priorities and approaches, including the choice not to regulate at all. In your opinion, has council given you the proper priorities and approaches and policies, including the choice not to regulate at all? Are you happy with what you have in your arsenal right now?
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner. I've been with the city for about 14 months. In my tenure here, I haven't received a lot of direction from the current council on how we should be enforcing our bylaws, and including the decision not to. A lot of the policies are very dated. For instance, the snow clearing matters, policies that the city seems to act on are back from 1993. I know they've been tested and discussed many times in administrations since, and the conclusions always seem to arrive in the same place for the same reasons. So in my experience, things are going well. I maybe defer to Ms. Kozierski, who's kind of done this for 34 years in the city.
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, I think, like Dave said, we haven't had this council for that length of time yet to really experience the support from the council and that type of thing. And of course, we have a new mayor who has stepped up and really supported staff in the bylaw division, which is something we lacked in the last administration and with the last council. In fact, our staff, for the first time in all the years I've been here with the last council, we were attacked a lot on what we did and when we did it and so on and so forth. We have never experienced that. We have had full support of our administration and our councillors for years here, and we feel that we're getting support from this council. We haven't had too many interactions to really judge that, but we're feeling very good about the change and the council that is here today to support us. I think we have unfortunately bylaws that are really old, Previous management didn't have an appetite to go forward with those. Staff requested that for a number of years. We've got to, get more fines or higher fines for certain things. An example is our sign bylaw, which is really dated, really creates a lot of problem for us for enforcement. There's 1 or 2 tickets in that fine schedule for $50. That's the price of doing business for some businesses these days. It really is totally ineffective. So we struggle with working with some of these bylaws that haven't been updated yet. Dave brought an appetite to bring those forward, so we're really starting to move with some of that, which is really necessary to do effective and consistent enforcement in the city. So right now we have extra staff that was hired, like you say, two new officers for parking. One of the positions was specific for parking because of what's being brought on with the hospital online. And the other officer was for parking, but also bylaw enforcement. We're in a position today, I have to say, our officers are correct and Dave is correct, in that it's the first time in all the years I've worked here that I've seen our officers struggling to keep up with the regular everyday calls for services on unsightly nuisance properties, noise complaints, sign complaints, bill complaints, assisting with the roads division, the building division, etc. They really struggle with that because, and especially from the months of, say, March till, we get some snow, they really struggle because right now they're spending the majority of their time doing security, filling in for a minor role for RCMP when they can't attend to things, being sanitation workers. That's never happened here before. So we have staff that's struggling to keep up with the regular everyday files that come in from our residents that expect some action. It is a struggle. We try to look at all kinds of different things. A suggestion has gone forward that possibly for next year we look at a dedicated team, possibly 1 or 2 officers, an RCMP officer, someone from VHA, et cetera, that are dedicated to deal with the social issues, the security sweeps, the encampments all over the city, and that would relieve our other officers to actually do work for the residents and get at it in a more efficient and quicker fashion. For a number of years, our policy was we had a 24-hour turnaround to attend to a property. That's rarely possible now due to all of this social disorder. So staff brought forward a suggestion that maybe that could be looked at. We've got to start thinking outside of the box because of the resources we have currently. And when I was doing a review for Dave the other day and calling some of the municipalities about their revenue, their number of officers, et cetera, I noted that Kelowna has done just that. They have a dedicated team that does all of their social disorder issues, and I think we're moving towards that because we have residents that aren't happy with the fact that they phoned in on last Monday and our officers just, they're in the queue and they just can't get there till the following Monday to even start looking at their issue. Now that isn't an every day. It doesn't happen every day. It isn't an issue that, we sort of can't overcome with, pulling somebody off of this and people to that. But you've got to remember too, with our encampments, because of the safety and security issue there, we have to have 2 officers at all times attend to an encampment. I did encampments 25 years ago. I mean, there was 2 a year, but I did them by myself, way out in Timbuktu, Stevenson Point Park, etc. We can't have that any longer. And in many cases, with regards to the issue we have tomorrow, we're going to have all officers on deck. We're probably going to have the whole bike team there and maybe a couple other RCMP officers, mainly because of the number of tents and the number of stuff we're dealing with, and the people that are there that we're well aware of pack a lot of these weapons. And we need to move on these things. We learned that lesson with Tent City. And so our resources are really stretched, to be honest. We're trying to do the best we can and look at ways of maybe thinking outside the box and getting different things working for the social disorder end of things.
Sorry, Mr. Rudolph, and then, no, you're going to have to respond. Mr. Rudolph, you have-
I thought I'd chime in a little bit because might be putting a little bit of pressure on Dave here. So just, I think it's part of the reason for today was just to put it all on the table. And this is what this workshop format's for, just to kind of, and the second part of the attachment, which is the business plan, which you'll have a more formal presentation on in budget time in November, is to make sure that you're aware of the landscape that this department is currently functioning in. You didn't have a business plan last year. It's the first time it's been put together. So, and there's been a lot of water under the bridge even in the last year. Dave has come on stream. We've done a reorganization. Council's adopted a strategic plan. We've adapted and adopted our work plan as much as possible around the strategic priorities that Council identified earlier in the first quarter of this year. This did not come up at that time. We're going to do a revisit of that in January. The annual check-in, you may realign some of your priorities at that time. But part of this is really just to bring this all together so you see the big picture and understand where things are at. To ask Dave if he would like more staff. Of course, any department head would like to say that. And, we put it to each of the departments to identify business cases that they felt were warranted. I think he's being very modest and respectful, because all these things are expensive. A lot of what we're hearing today is around the housing and homelessness task force kind of issues and public safety issues. We've got a task force on that and another GPC scheduled in the near future to talk about public safety. But there's been, the police are really busy with big files, and they're kind of not as able to deliver on lower queue priorities that perhaps they would like to or used to. So and we've seen a significant uptick in the volume of the issues in the last year or 2 years around social disorder on the streets. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. So to say that we need more people, we just need to be understanding the whole lay of the land and make sure it's apples to apples comparisons with some of the other municipalities. I know in Abbotsford, I think we had 8 officers. It's very conversations happening there too. So I think every municipality is wrestling with this. And so, giving you the right set of information to understand this, and then by the time we get the budget, if it's your direction to increase this resource or that type of thing, you're in a position to understand why. So we're leading up to that. So this is just put it on the table, see what you have to say, and I think you still got 2 pieces to go on this, and then a wrap up. So that's all we're trying to do is get it out there. And maybe we'll end up with a second meeting on this for all I know. I'm not sure.
Okay, so next we have Mayor Crowe, followed by Councilor Thorpe, Councilor Martin, and Councilor Desbrook, and then if you have something else on. You've got to be fair here.
Oh, absolutely. I'm fine.
Thank you very much, Chair, and through you to Mr. Barish and his team. I want to thank them very much for what they do. I can say with some note of sadness looking back in my legal career that nothing was more intractable in dealing with those neighborhood disputes where people were expecting publicly paid officials to solve their neighborhood problems and complaints, and there was always at least one good neighbor in every neighborhood who was making complaints chronically about their neighbors or being critical or expecting to be held to high standards. And as any good lawyer will tell you, there is no way you could possibly satisfy them from an expense point of view that would justify the kind of cost. And so it gets, instead of being dealt with as a private nuisance claim, it gets foisted onto public officials in the hopes that they can somehow perform the miracle that the complainant isn't prepared to pay a lawyer to solve. Having said that, one of the concerns that's been expressed directly and indirectly around this and through other correspondence with council is that perhaps we're not getting our bang for our buck, that we should be generating more revenue. And what have I heard today? That 70% of bylaw enforcement time is spent shifting the poor from one part of our community to the other. Correct, Mr. LaBerge? And so the concept of generating revenue by fining the poor for being poor and homeless seems to me to speak very directly to this concern. And I'm interested to see when we get a chance in our strategic discussions around the strategic plan and also around the upcoming budget, how much more money we're prepared to spend on this. Because when I look at the list of complaints that I've received in the last 11 months as mayor, the vast majority of those complaints and concerns do not revolve around snow removal, they do not revolve around graffiti, they do not revolve around some of the problems that have been mentioned today. They revolve around the issue of homelessness and street disorder. And so what I'm being told is that we're spending a huge chunk of our time trying to deal with that in an area where we're never going to generate any revenue. And so if this council wants to step ahead and employ the necessary bylaw enforcement and staff and time, then that's the question. That's the big question we have to consider. What are our priorities going to be in light of what we've heard today about the expense and the amount of staff time that is spent dealing with great respect, as Mr. LeBerge pointed out, situations that weren't faced by bylaw officers 20 and 30 years ago with the weapons. Indeed, one of our councillors experienced watching, I'll call it the takedown of an individual who turned out to be the subject of a warrant, who had significant weapons, most of them in breach of the Criminal Code of Canada. So I think it's time for us to talk some real turkey about what we can and cannot do, what we can reasonably do within our budget, and what the public's prepared to support us in doing on this issue.
Here, here.
Okay, next we have Councillor Thorpe, followed by Councillor Martland, Giselbrecht, Bonner, and Brown. And I think at that point, surely to goodness there aren't any more discussions.
Well, there's more presentation.
Yeah, we can.
On this topic. Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. So I've been making notes through the presentation, and first of all, I want to say that I have found this a very powerful presentation. And along with other councillors, I want to express my sincere thanks to our bylaw department, Mr. LeBerge and the others, Ms. Kazurski, and I know your staff. I think, in my opinion, have the toughest job of all of our city employees, and I mean no disrespect to any other department. But I can't imagine the situations that you have to deal with, and we're hearing how this is made, has been made exponentially more difficult by the homelessness crisis and the problems associated with that. So I would encourage you in future looking ahead to please be honest with council in terms of what we can do to help you. It might not be possible to give you all the resources that you would in an ideal world ask for, but certainly let us know how we can be of assistance, because I think it's very important that this council shows publicly its support for its staff. Not just your department, in fact, but we're talking your department today. Sometimes in the past, unfortunately, that has not been the case, and how counterproductive that was. So council needs to support you. The public, I hope, is listening to this presentation, and I hope they will understand that they need to support you. And you deserve their support. Just as the police are under pressure and have to establish priorities about responding to calls, so do you. So the barking dog is not a 911 issue. It might have to wait. And a number of other issues as well. There's one thing that I did want to comment on, but it has been covered, so I'll keep it short, and that is the philosophy that our goal is compliance, not generating revenue. And I think that has been a decision in past. Maybe a future decision will change that, but I suspect you're going to comment on that when we come to parking as well. Compliance is the desired outcome. And the second thing, and this I don't think has been explained as much as I'd like to hear about, maybe if you could just take a minute, Mr. LeBerge, and talk about the effectiveness of the reasonably new mediation process, which is used with our bylaw infractions as opposed to going to court. I think it's been fairly successful. I think it's saved us a lot of money, and I wonder if you could just expound on that briefly.
Yes, through the chair, thank you for your comments, Councillor Thorpe. We have streams of either sending matters to provincial court for prosecution, which we have to hire private counsel, or we can go through an adjudication service. Each year, the provincial government provides a gazette of accredited adjudication services. These are legally trained professionals that will hear cases and just render a finding of the offense happened or didn't happen And that's the whole threshold there. They're not going to hear charter challenges or anything else. We convened these hearings here in the Stark Building in this room, and an adjudicator usually works from Vancouver for a day and hear the cases. I don't know specifically how much it costs per case, maybe.
It's, through the chair to Dave, it's shared with the other municipalities that have disputes that are heard at the same time. So as an example, Nanaimo might have 5 disputes being heard that day, Parksville 3, Duncan 4, etc. The costs are shared. The general cost for an adjudicator who is assigned to us from the Attorney General's office is about $450 for the day. And, you know, we have currently just written into our bylaws some fees that we will charge the municipalities. In the beginning of this, we didn't charge anyone anything. We accepted the costs for security for the day and so on and so forth. We are now going to split that up between the municipalities. So it's a really, really reasonable cost to us to have these adjudications. And they work really well for us. Previously, we would have to go to traffic court or before a provincial judge to deal with issues. The beauty of the adjudication, the dispute adjudication registry system is that an officer issuing a ticket does not have to appear either. Whether it's a fire inspector, whether it's a bylaw officer, whether it's an RCMP officer, should they choose to want to come, fine. They give a statement, the adjudicator listens to the person that comes to the adjudication and can base decisions on statements that are given to them also. And the costs are really minimal for the effect we get. And over the years, I've been to provincial court and Supreme Court for the city a number of times, and I can tell you more people show up for this. They're not as intimidated as going to provincial court, so they're happier to come to adjudication and have their say and adjudicated.
Thank you very much.
That's it?
Yes.
Thank you. Next, we have Councillor Martin.
Thank you, and through the chair, this may be covered a little bit later, but since we're talking, out of curiosity, when we talk about the revenues for the fines that's listed here, I'm wondering, are these the fines that we've issued, or is this what we've actually collected?
Through the chair, Councillor Martman, the revenues that are listed are what is issued. From an accounting standpoint, we have to record the full revenue. Anything that is still outstanding sits on the books as a receivable, and anything we write off shows up as an expense at the end.
So, if I may, Chair, so a ballpark figure, how much do we usually collect of the fines?
For bylaw enforcement in 2018, we had just under $87,000 of revenue, and we wrote off half of that.
About 50%. Okay. And that's the thing with tickets. So I didn't understand why we would ticket the homeless for panhandling, because I wasn't sure how they were going to pay for it except for by panhandling. So I think this is where you have to be balanced.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Councillor Desilets.
Thank you, Chair. For you to Mr. Rudolph, I'm just curious, the bylaws function, is it going to sit under corporate services? Like, I know we're looking for a director, I'm just curious sort of how.
Your worship, or Mr. Chair, through the Councillor Gesselbrecht, the alignment with the Development Services Group is a good one because it has so many pieces attached to that department with the building inspection, just the whole leadership role that planning is taken with the homeless and that type of thing. The piece that was mentioned about the consolidation, that is something we've been talking about, is how to make this more efficient, and the possible closure of the downtown location. Is that something that we should be doing? I think that's a bit of a sensitive topic. From a consolidation point of view, it might make me more centralized may be easier to manage, but I'm not sure it's what the signal that we want to send on that. So there's a conversation we have to have about that. Dave has mentioned also about the police. We're actually doing a little bit of a space plan for the third floor of the SARC building to accommodate more officers in that area. So it is entirely possible that we can consolidate and show just that maybe even improve our effectiveness and enforcement through that. So the organizational structure is, I think, the commonplace for bylaws is attached to the Development Services Department. All my experience has always been there. I understand that model. I think it works well. And the other thing I should say is this is obviously a work in progress. We've spent the first year of this administration with me here and with you here working on governance and trying to make up for some time when we weren't in a great position. And so we spent a lot of effort on that. It's a work in progress. So much of what you're talking about now is not perfect, and we're trying to get better at it and work our way through this. So even on the parking file, we're aware that it's not perfect, and we're working our way through this. So we're just trying to address things that are priorities, and we're all very busy. And governance is, I think a lot of the suggestions that we're hearing about are understood, but it's just a matter of how much priority you want to put on those topics and what kind of organizational effectiveness can we bring to it with or without additional resources. I think that's another theme. We are very much under your direction as a council, and your direction is coming from the priorities that you establish, and at the top of the list is the strategic plan and your strategic priorities. So I'm pleased to, and in addition to that, we have to be nimble and fluid. So we respond to that, and we respect that. So I think the budget process will give you the final say on how to deal with it in this year.
Yeah, just follow up on that. Just grateful to have this conversation today and sort of get an overview and get some ideas and thoughts out on the table. It's an example of our governance systems being put in place. Also, we do want to acknowledge that we have really been focusing on the priorities. I mean, first things first, and I'm down in Hohen Park in the mornings regularly, and I see the bylaw enforcement officers, large numbers of them, there dealing with large numbers of people in encampments, and it is not an easy situation to be in. Like, we're in a pinch point where we have a huge social crisis, and from what I've seen, it does fall on the shoulders of bylaw officers on the front line. And when you're dealing with somebody who's sleeping out in the cold, who has their life possessions with them, as well as complaints with people from needles in the park and social disorder, you're put in an incredibly hard situation with not the right resources in place. And so I think that our bylaw officers have been very compassionate and have been dealing with a lose-lose situation and have been keeping a lid on it. Because when you think about the amount of material that was in the tent city when that was moved out, and I see that the trucks filled on a daily basis of material being moved back and forth, things would be much, much worse if our bylaws officers and department was not focusing on this issue. The social disorder that we've seen around would be much, much worse. So I just want to say, one, thank you for that focus, and lastly, this council is very focused on creating a culture of support. We're focused on creating a culture of collaboration. We're also really want to have a culture where we're open and we're discussing where the issues are, where we might be short on capacity, when we need to discuss where the issues are and the vision of where we need to get to. And I think that finally is like a culture of initiative. So I really appreciate the ideas that were brought forward and hearing it for the first time about a specific task force focusing on the encampments, because that's a huge amount of resources. And if we can draw on other folks within health services or whatnot, that'll be huge. And then hearing ideas about the consolidation, I think that's something that this type of initiative and problem solving of how we can be more efficient and effective is what we want to promote and spur on. So thank you for the conversation today, and yeah, thanks.
Councilor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair Turley, and through you to Mr. Burge and staff for all that thing. If if you believe that you're under-resourced and that extra officers in this particular area would help out, especially on the area of social disorder, that is a budgetary increase I will defend forever. Like, I don't have a problem with that sort of thing. And I don't think the vast majority of the people who are sending us all these emails would have a problem with that either. Maybe some of them. But just to let you know, as we go into our budget process.
You're done?
I'm done.
Thank you. Councilor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair Turley. I think it's a straw man fallacy to really say that what we're talking about here today is ticketing the homeless. The ticketing the homeless because 70%, that's not what we're talking about. So I think that needs to be crystal clear. Because those kind of arguments don't progress in a positive manner. So, and I don't think anybody's saying that we should be viewing bylaws as a source of revenue. But revenue and expenditures are important for determining the effectiveness of our policies and place. What are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the outcomes? So I think we do need to have that information so we can identify gaps. And that in turn feeds into setting council's priorities so then staff and the community know what they are, and staff can come back and say, if you want to have these type of conversations, or if you want this type of enforcement, these are the gaps that are in place, and this is how you can address them. And then that decision rests on council. Resources, budgets, those belong to us. Because I think we've heard today that some of our fines are inadequate and make it hard for staff to do their job. That the very fact that 70% of our potential staff time is being spent on something that was not in their job description, that encampments that used to be twice a year that one person could sort of reasonably manage to dismantle, now becomes almost a departmental initiative that RCMP supports, and we just see the numbers. Those are things that we need to know. Because I think, at some point there's going to have to be a difference in philosophical approach of what is traditional bylaw and what is the modern challenges that we're facing in our city. And if we're not willing to address those and maybe identify more creative approaches, give staff the support by new types of staffing or new types of resources in education and training, that's staff support. Simply saying thank you for doing your job is not. So, I think it's great, we should acknowledge the work they do, but if all we're going to do is say thank you, keep doing the hard work that you're doing, that is not supporting the staff. So I think that we just need to have these conversations, maybe more fully, have more information, because I would agree with Councilor Bonner, and I'm picking up on the sentiment there, is that moving forward, I think we do need to address these challenges head on and differently, and give the folks that are not sitting at this table but are out there in the parks in the morning and late in the evenings and cleaning up things that no person should really have to see, let alone live. If we're not helping those folks out, we're not helping our community. So.
Okay, I think we've exhausted all the questions, so Mr. LaBerge, if you could continue the parking, please.
I retired from policing, and my colleagues told me you don't really know what conflict really is until you manage parking, and I think it was venturing into this without my parking clerk, which is like walking on my own for the first time, so I'm a little nervous. I'm going to make the parking segment very brief because I think this is probably as complex an issue as what we just covered, and I think a lot of this is for another day, but I just want to touch some of the highlights of what parking looks like in the community. And certainly in the conversation, I will acknowledge that Mr. Jamie Rose is in the back, our traffic engineering manager. He and his group actually have really stepped up and are taking a significant role in the management and planning pieces that I'm going to touch on. So a few of the high points, what we administer downtown is, number one is our parkade infrastructure. So we have about 900 spots between the three parkades, 292 in Bastion, 301 in Harbourfront, and 308 in Honk. And my parking clerk that works out of the CPSO navigates all the nuances on who gets those spots. 10 or 15 years ago, our parking rates were set very low because our infrastructure wasn't being used. There wasn't a lot of demand. I can tell you that we're almost at capacity everywhere now. We typically allot about 75 to 85% of the available spaces to monthly pass holders, and that's where the lion's share of our revenue comes from. The remainder is available for daily parkers. As I said, the parking rates are set by bylaw, and they haven't been touched in many years. And I'll tell you, it's actually the parking rates that largely determine where people are going to park, not where we write our tickets, but people go where the cheap parking is. And I think 75 cents for 2 hours in our parkades, it's a very, very good deal. It's such a good deal. I think people in some areas and around somewhere, boat ramps like to get tickets from us because it's cheaper than getting parking from BC ferries. So something to think about. We're looking at the downtown parking and more from like an events center perspective. So it's one thing what it looks like during the day when people are going to work, but at night, think of those perfect storms. We have a Port Theatre event with 800 patrons attending. The ICC has events with 1,000 people in it. The Coast Hotel, 179 rooms plus all their events that go up. And I can tell you, the Coast Hotel tells us their occupancy average is 86 to 96% now, and it used to be half of that. Coastal Credit Union, they've just doubled their ask from 70 to 140 reserved spots down there. That is the parking garage for a lot of residents of Gabriel and Protection, Pacifica. We've got a bunch of new buildings down there. So this parking's a real business for us, and a lot of cities actually farm this out to third-party entities that do exactly that, run it as a business instead of having a little cop trying to navigate these issues. And we also provide long-term storage for about 15 vehicles with disabled placards. A couple of issues that I see that are really prevailing in our parkage right now. It goes back to that homelessness piece. Our parkades really are vicarious shelters. I'm sure when you leave your council meetings late in the evening, and when I come out of there, there's 15 people in or around there. It's really spiked up our crime around there. So much so, when we had the tent city, we used to have 2 private security guards 24 hours a day downtown that really guarded our infrastructure. We're back to our normal service delivery, which is 1 security guard 18 hours a day. I had a bit of money left over in my security budget, and I've now hired a second one for 8 hours during the night hours. And I put them exclusively in the parkades just because we have nightly events and attacks on vehicles, and it's been put tremendous frustration and pressure on a lot of our stakeholders like the hotels and the island residents. There's a lot of call for, they want gates and CCTV and lots of infrastructure. So those aspects are becoming tremendously challenged. Another thing, as I say, our parking rates are very inexpensive, and we gather parking revenues that's supposed to pay for itself, and our parkades, some of them are really aging down there. They're a lot of money to maintain. We've just replaced the tension strand beams for millions of dollars, and now we're going to put the new surface membranes on these things, and that's just to preserve some extra life. But yeah, we get a lot of revenue from parking, but it costs us a lot of money as well. Our on-street parking, it's been rising up nicely in recent years. Just downtown's getting busier and busier. We hit a significant snag in 2018, as everybody knows, that all of our old antique single-head parking meters were attacked repeatedly. They were pried apart and thrown out. We gather them up, put them back together. But the reality is this is very old technology, and we can't even get parts from them anymore, and we had to make the difficult decision to pull them out about 110 meters and revert those areas to 2-hour parking. It's created changes in our parking flow and created some other congestion, but more significantly from a revenue perspective, we're about $120,000 in revenue a year as a result of that. So where that's flowing to coming in 2020 is Mr. Rose has commissioned the downtown mobility study that's near completion now, and that's assessing a lot of things downtown, as you're aware, including the traffic and parking flows, evaluating parking demand, looking at what the parking rates are and where they should be. And we would anticipate that there's going to be recommendations about next phases of rolling paid parking into other areas of downtown. I can tell you from the equity perspective, I talk about a lot of the complaints and pushback I get about parking, but one of the clear messages that I've heard since I've come to the city is from the merchants that are on Commercial Street, and they say, we bought and paid parking 10 years ago, and, yes, we get it and stuff. And for some reason, it ended on Terminal Avenue, and everybody else in the Old City Quarter, they don't pay for it. And why are we always at this disadvantage? I mean, make it fair, make everybody pay for parking downtown or take it out of here. And these are the types of messaging that I hear every day downtown. And hopefully we'll get some of the answers of what the solution to those are with Mr. Rose's study. We're looking at a few exciting advancements here that'll just make it easier. The new technology that I hope to have online by the end of the year. That's the pay-by-plate technology and pay-by-phone. Nominal cost to add these things, and it's just where the industry is evolving. And the last piece of that is the hospital area. One of the bylaw officers we hired this year was to take over the enforcement role from the municipal enforcement officers in the hospital area. We expect that the new meters and parking signage should be up by January 2020, and we'll commence taking over the enforcement in that area. We also manage 4 surface lots downtown, a couple in Cavan, Selby, and Wentworth. Likewise, they are becoming increasingly popular and filling up. We're almost to our permit capacity everywhere. We've added features over time like the modal sharing, so car sharing program. We have electric car charging stations in our parkades. And as we get the results of that parking study, really we're going to have to look at some updating. As everybody's probably aware, our traffic bylaw is very old, 25 some odd years. It's kind of a joint ownership between traffic engineering and us, and probably flowing from whatever our studies are and our parking rates. We'd be probably looking at a rewrite in 2020. That's all that I really wanted to say about parking in the absence of my parking clerks.
Councillor Armstrong.
Just a question on that. When we go to the Port of Denamo Center, there's the 308, and you said anywhere at 234 class occupancy. Does that include the 90 spots that were given to PEG, or are those not included there yet?
So we have a month-to-month lease with the casino in Nanaimo, and I think there's 60 spots that we rent to them with the understanding of when the new hotel's built that we'll terminate that agreement and those will be available to the new hotel.
And then we'll have to find another 30, because isn't the agreement 90 spots?
It's unreserved spots. So at the moment we're updating our agreement with the Coast Hotel. And whatever agreement we finalize with the Coast will end up being the same hotel with PEG. So we do have an agreement with PEG, we'll need to amend it once the Coast agreement is updated. Again, this kind of goes back to Mr. LaBerge was saying about Mr. Rose's downtown study. So there's a number of things on the go at the moment that are going to really influence how we do this. The parking longer term agreements have been done through the bylaw parking group. The real estate department's been involved as well, and engineering's been involved. I think hopefully now we're going to have a bit more consolidated approach to this. So there is a shortage of parking for sure, and it's how Mr. LaBerge said, it's how we actually manage it for these peak events. We might need to actually reduce some of our commitments to various people.
Thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair Turley. 2 questions. I'm just wondering the extent of the area, essentially the geographical area of the hospital area. I actually received quite a few comments about this. People were just wondering when it's coming online. And then just a question, Mr. Corson there, with the downtown mobility study identify whether we're going to need a parkade, essentially, another parkade, is that, or is it, and again, what is the area of the downtown mobility study?
Mr. Rose would probably best speak to those questions.
Jenny?
Through the chair, sorry if you can repeat the questions. One was downtown, I can't.
First one, I was just wondering the geographical extent of the hospital area parking.
Roughly Strathmore to town site and Bowen to Waddington.
Okay, thank you.
And the downtown area is roughly a 800-meter radius from downtown, so it's roughly the top of the hill with water from the river to Wilson.
You mean boundaries to Waddington?
Bowen to Waddington, Strathmore, Meredith, Townsend.
Okay, oh, this way, you go this way. Okay, got it.
Oh, sorry, yes, and whether or not there's need for additional off-street parking, we are going to be getting the consultant to extend that portion of the study. So.
Thank you.
Councilor Brown, Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to add to what Mr. Rose is saying, I believe we've got the consultants coming next Monday, the 4th, to just give an update on the downtown parking mobility study, and that kind of kicks off a month of public communication as well. So it'll be starting to talk with council first and then move in a more broad direction.
Councilor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to Mr. LaBerge. On page 12, the most noticeable part of that graph is that all the revenue is down except for the VICC stalls. Do we have an idea why that is?
Through the chair to Councillor Bonner, there are a lot of nuisances to the permitting revenue, and I bolts are so small. There are a lot of things that change over time, such as one parkade there was a change in policy a few years ago, free parking on evenings and weekends. Some of the infrastructure has been closed down for repairs at different periods of time. There's just a lot of operational factors that disrupt the flow of permits.
I was just curious, of all the years, it's only going down now, which is a bit concerning.
Possibly, is it year to date?
This year to date.
No, it's projected, I'm going with.
Oh, okay.
We lost 120,000 too, don't forget,
That's
for the
different.
meters.
That's on the next page. On the next page, on-street parking, I'm not going to tell you I told you so, but I think I might. Is when we had this conversation and we okayed $15,000 of paper signs, the suggestion at that time there was a company that does the parking for Harrison Hot Springs who would be willing to come here and install paid meters for us for $35,000. So we may have been able to mitigate some of that $120,000 loss had we been able to do that. That's my questions or statements.
Okay, if there's no further questions, please carry on with the next portion, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll finish off briefly with animal control services. So the city regulates the keeping and control of animals through our animal control bylaw, which was from 1995. You've seen the chart, so there's significant revenue that comes in through that line, and that's substantially from the sale of dog licenses. I checked with Revenue Services this morning, and it's about 7,000 licenses a year. 100% of that revenue is used to provide funding for the shelter operation. This is a contract that is sent out for 3-year intervals, and it's currently the Nanaimo Animal Control Services Limited. That contract was issued in 2015, and it was extended until August of 2020 last year. Now, in preparation of the contract renewal, a service review is going to be undertaken, and it's going to look at a number of things. The purpose of the service, or how we do it, the legislative framework as it currently exists, the scope of the activities that the work that they do for us. For instance, doesn't include investigation of barking dog complaints. That's done by the bylaw services. There are other issues such as licensing a cat, which comes up often. They're going to look for us at the delivery model. A lot of municipalities do it in-house. Other ones have partnerships with other municipalities. So they're going to look at the different models and some potential service outcomes. And the whole idea is to identify what our service issues and needs are as we renew that contract. What I can see coming into the city most recently is there a couple of significant issues. Number one is that the current animal shelter was constructed in 1950 and then added on in about 1977 when they built the kennels. They evaluated the building a couple of years ago, and it would seem that it's well short of the current Canadian standards for animal care. And so the question is, do you spend a lot of money renovating a very old building that may be at the end of its life? Do you replace it? Do you look at other opportunities? And this are one of the questions that we're going to ask of the consultant. The second aspect that we'd really like to have a critical look at is what our current service levels are. Currently they have 2 full-time animal control officers, supplemented by the supervisor who actually does the animal contract with Victoria as well. So he comes up two days a week, I believe. So we have 2.5 animal control officers for the entire city, supplemented during the summer months with a seasonal position for about 3 or 4 months. This was the service standard that was created, my understanding, in the 1980s, and it hasn't changed since then. So you invariably have one animal control officer now working in the city, doing all the call-outs, and I've seen just in the short time I've been here that the number of call-outs and the overtime is starting to rise significantly, and they are really stretched. You have basically 2 animal control officers that are on call for half of their life. And it's not just dealing with animals at large, but it's dog bite investigations. Some of these things are very time-consuming, and I touched on one of the pieces of litigation we're working on right now. They're very serious and have a lot of liability ramifications to the city. Another thing that they do is pick up animal carcasses throughout the city, which sounds reasonable. I mean, we're talking deer and cats and dogs, etc., but also marine life that wash up on our beaches, which sometimes can be really significant, meaning you got to get down 200 steps into an area and then deal with a seal carcass on the beach. So it takes a lot of actually training, a lot of equipment and boats and harnesses and everything else. So really when you get into the nuances of what they do, there's really a lot to this work, and we really want to look at what we want out of our next contract. And then the thing that's going to have to flow out of that, as I said, our animal control bylaw is very dated, and I think it needs a lot of work. There's things like a ban on restricted breeds, meaning we have certain breeds that have to be muzzled and are considered dangerous, and we get a great deal of input saying breeds aren't dangerous, poorly trained dogs are, and there's a lot of advocacy to remove those types of sections. And I know from my enforcement experience, they're really not enforceable anyways, because short of taking a DNA test, you can't say with any certainty what breed of a dog is at large. So many nuances of that. I won't belabor, just to say that we just engaged a consultant to have a look at that, and there'll be a great deal of work in this area and how we move forward in 2020.
Okay, any questions on that portion of Mr. Burge's presentation? Seeing none, I'm going to, sorry?
Call a break?
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break, and I believe following that, we get into a discussion on the commercial properties law, bus routes, and the delegation is first, Ms. Greer.
That's correct, Chair. So
So
we'll hear from
5 minutes. I'll be right back. time, we will be discussing the commercial properties along bus routes, and we have a delegation who will speak to this issue, Ms. Wanda Thompson, and I believe you're all set up with the, you will be, there we are, okay.
Oh, great.
The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. My name is Wanda Thompson. I'm here today representing Walk in Nanaimo, a new pedestrian advocacy group, and to talk about keeping pedestrians safe on our streets during snow events. Doesn't want to work.
Oh, it's people were having used the keyboard the other night.
Great. Walk in Nanaimo, our vision is simple. It's that Nanaimo is a safe, connected, and inviting place for everyone to walk. We want to promote a culture and create an environment where pedestrians are acknowledged, respected, and feel safe walking at all times. One word summarizes this issue, snow clearing on sidewalks, and that's safety. The city has a responsibility to ensure that our streets are safe for everyone, not just for drivers. We've just heard that bylaw compliance and safety are two key priorities for bylaw services. Last year's snow event put people at risk. It was not unusual, and we did hear from citizens across the city that their safety had been put at risk. Seniors, persons with disabilities, school children, parents, and babies in strollers. The approach that the City of Nanaimo has taken needs to be improved. We're urging Council to take decisive action in 3 areas to improve the safety of pedestrians. Public outreach. Public outreach is broader than just communications, and it involves meeting with some of your key stakeholders, including key commercial property owners, SD 68, neighborhood associations, service clubs. Broader and more proactive communications would also need to be improved, and clearly indicating that the bylaws will be enforced, and ending messaging that ignores pedestrians. These are a couple of clips taken from the city's website. One of them suggests people should walk on the side of the road during a snow event, which is unsafe, and also indicates that the city will plow snow onto sidewalks, which also is definitely not a best practice. Enforcing existing bylaws. So last year, Bylaw Services publicly stated the city would not enforce snow clearing bylaws. This essentially guaranteed many sidewalks were left impassable and unsafe across the city for weeks. We hear the bylaws can't be enforced equitably, or that enforcement causes conflict in the last presentation. But the BC Ombudsman's report recommended that an enforcement policy would help address these issues. So I don't know whether Nanaimo has a broad enforcement policy for its bylaws. You tabled today a 1993 policy on enforcement for this particular bylaw, but it doesn't appear that it has been followed recently. But if it were enforced based on the criteria, and it would represent a significant improvement over no enforcement at all. Ensuring objectivity and fairness can be achieved with better communications and an unambiguous enforcement policy. Lastly, leadership. The City of Nanaimo itself failed to clear many of its own sidewalks. And I think it's important for the city to lead by example. So clearing sidewalks and pathways, not plowing snow onto sidewalks. This practice of plowing snow onto sidewalks not only undermines the folks that actually did clear their sidewalks, it sends a message that pedestrians don't matter. Pedestrians are a top priority in the Transportation Master Plan. We believe this needs to be operationalized by allocating appropriate equipment, staff, and money to clearing the city's own sidewalks and pathways. Not all the sidewalks across the city, but at least the city's own, as to set an example. Sidewalk snow clearing is about ensuring the safety of all Nanaimo citizens. There are examples in other cities of best practices that are cost-effective, efficient, and safe solutions. What is inequitable is a city policy and practice that makes road clearing the top priority, but relies on goodwill of citizens for the safety of those whose only means of transportation may be walking. Citizens have made it clear that the existing approaches aren't acceptable, and we've seen 8 months elapse since the last snow event, and it's not clear that there are options on the table for alternative approaches to try to address these issues. We're asking for council to take meaningful action that will put the safety of pedestrians first and ensure that no one is put at risk again this winter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Thompson. We have Mayor Crowe.
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Chair, to Ms. Thompson. Thank you for your thoughtful presentation. I appreciate it, and I say this as somebody who's lived in the wet coast all of my life, 40 years steadily in the city. The snow events we're getting, sometimes much more significant than we have in the past. And I guess, and I'm going to ask you the same question that council has to ask itself, that we have to ask staff. We're not a city that regularly experiences significant snow. This is not, well, to use the example of the CO, we worked in Fredericton for a while. We don't have boulevards. You said, don't put the snow up on the sidewalk, but for practical purposes, if you're going to clear the street, which represents the way most of our citizens get around, what do we do in a practical way? Are you prepared to support, purchasing the kind of equipment that could haul it away? What do we do to address it in a practical way for what is a relatively short period of time? Because if it's contracting out and hiring contractors, I think you appreciate, they're all busy doing their private contracts, and most of the malls, et cetera, already have that kind of equipment tied up. What do you think is a reasonable way to approach it? I've got the list of concerns, and I appreciate that. But what's the practical response that we can give as a city within what I will call a reasonably responsible fiscal framework? Because we can't hire a bunch of folks extra and just lay them off. We have union obligations, et cetera. So I'm interested in hearing those comments from you, please.
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on this, and there are many good examples in cities similar to Nanaimo where we do just get isolated snow events. So there are other best practices out there to deal with these, relatively short periods where you do get snow. The other point I want to make is this isn't about asking the city to clear 450 kilometers of sidewalk. Most of those sidewalks are in front of other property owners, and it's about making sure that those other property owners, particularly the commercial ones who front on main transit routes and along, shopping malls, that those commercial property owners do fulfill their obligations and comply with the bylaw to clear their sidewalks. And I think that sending a signal that we will not enforce bylaws meant that we did have uncleared sidewalks. People knew there would be no enforcement, and so there was no compliance, basically. But most of the important stretches of sidewalk are along main bus routes, and most of it is large commercial property owners. And I can't tell them how to do their business, but if they're already paying a contractor to clear 100% of their parking lot, for example, given that 2 centimeters of snow means nobody leaves their house in Nanaimo, they could probably get away with clearing 70% of their parking lot and using the rest of that money to clear the sidewalk in front of their property. So I think there are some ways to address it. The city certainly isn't responsible for all of the sidewalks in terms of clearing it themselves. Another thing we heard was that, people work very, very hard 24/7 and many days in a row overtime to clear the roads, and that trucks were going constantly. And, another option is to consider whether, priority streets are cleared, but that some of those staff resources are also used to clear city sidewalks, not other sidewalks, but the city sidewalks, so that when people are trying to get to social events at Bevan Park or other city facilities, they're able to do that in a safe way. And, I would also say in terms of communications, SD 68 was probably the most egregious offender not clearing any sidewalks in front of many elementary schools. Now, I understand the city cannot enforce bylaws with SD 68, but certainly they're part of the governance structure of this city, and working with them in a way and reaching out to them to make sure that they clear their own sidewalks would go a long way to keeping kids safe, for sure.
Follow-up?
Very quick follow-up. I just want to note that Mr. Rudolph is making a note around School District 68, so I expect there to be some communication. And if it gives you any comfort, Mr. Sims Diamond plows put the stuff up in my driveway too, and I have to keep shoveling.
Councillor Armstrong.
Just a question, you mentioned that there were some other cities we could look at, because when I was looking, most do the same thing. So do you have somewhere I can go check, because I know Calgary, the Prairies, they don't even clear the sidewalks, they don't worry about it. Or actually, that's the streets, the only streets they clear in Calgary and Saskatoon, those are the main thoroughfares used by ambulances and stuff. So is there some locally that you can refer me to?
I haven't done research on which cities have best practices. We've heard lots of anecdotal evidence, though, of different ways of approaching some of these challenges. Like, for example, rather, if you have a 4-lane road, for example, rather than plowing the snow onto the sidewalk, it's left in the gutter. And I understand that there are issues with drainage, but your choice then is, are you keeping your most vulnerable users, kids, seniors, persons with disabilities, safe on the sidewalk, or are you going to have hope and patience that the snow will melt and go down the drain? So there are choices to be made, certainly, but people offered during last year's snow event many anecdotal stories of other places they lived in, including places like Calgary and Vancouver, where they do take different approaches, and some of it is enforcement, where there are, there is enforcement and fines. And I note that the 1993 policy that was tabled as part of today's presentation actually does isolate, commercial property owners and transit routes as a top priority above, the residential side streets.
Yeah, and just one other point on that. When this motion came up, I heard from lots of business owners that they do put their name on a list for contractors, and the backlog is 3 to 4 days. So they've complied with what's required by requesting that. So long as they've asked for it and they can show they're on the list, then that's complied with the bylaw.
Where does it say that that's compliance with the bylaw?
Well, if you go look at the court rulings, they'll say that if they've made an effort to do that by hiring a contractor, and we only have a certain number of contractors in town, then that's due diligence on their part. Just so you know.
Okay, Councillor Bonner.
As a person who used to plow snow for a living, in Windsor, of all places, whatever.
Was you around with it?
No, almost around. The contract was very specific. You plowed the parking lot and you plowed the sidewalk. So we all had little snow blowers that we pulled off the trucks and we did the sidewalk as well. So it's all part of the same contract, and as the reason this motion came forward when it did was in order to give commercial entities along these routes the opportunity to write it into their snow removal contract. It's not a separate thing. It's all part of the same contract.
Okay, are there any further questions of Ms. Thompson? Hearing none, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, and sure we'll be ready to talk. I believe, Mr. Sims, you're...
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Head to the front, I guess.
Mr. Barrett is on the spot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly in introduction, as this report in front of you is a response to the motion that was put on the table in August, and to respond by this date. And really in the context of Mr. LeBerge's presentation, we wanted to sort of build on that and create the context around what we already do for snow clearing and vegetation management. We found that this question comes up ever since 1993 and probably before then. Every few years we get a sort of a raft of information that says, why doesn't the city clear sidewalks? So the city has a policy where we do clean in front of our sidewalks. And we've, as His Worship's noted, there's this sort of tug between plowing the road versus the city sidewalks, and this is the ongoing, I don't want to call it a conflict, but challenge that we have. We have zero place for snow storage. And I think the key issue, the key perspective for sidewalks or any of our snow clearing priorities is not really the users of the road, it's really for emergency services and transit. Those are the sort of top priority. Our focus is really trying to clear the routes for emergency services so that ambulance, police, fire can get to where they need to go. And lumped in with that is our partners at RDN Transit, so we can move people, because if people are nervous about driving, we have challenges with the messaging around snow tires, etc. But if people are nervous about driving, then at least they can ride a bus. Having said that, we're always looking at opportunities for improvement, and I think the capacity in our communications department has recently quadrupled, shall we say. So, you know, our routine, as the report notes, the routine communications that we do every year, we update the website, we're in front of council usually around this time of year, and you can anticipate something a little bit later, just describing, mostly for the public's benefit, how we approach snow removal, snow clearing, and how this year there's already meetings going on. It's a cross-departmental function. Really, we have parks, we have public works, we have communications, we have legislative services, we have bylaw, sort of all working together in this issue. So we're sort of elevating that this year. We are, I don't want to use the word emergency management, but it's kind of sort of an emergency management structure. So we're putting parks supervisors or managers into the public works yard so that there's this balancing of resources. We're reconsidering some of the priorities that we've done for many years, so that a parking lot at a park doesn't get plowed before the street in front of the park or the access. So we're looking for opportunities, bending and sort of reprioritizing things more towards transit routes, as an example. So some of the responses that we've already undertaken is shifting those priorities to trailways such as E&N Trail. That was a few years ago, but now we've got sort of new priorities like the Georgia Greenway between two schools, and looking at the Trans-Canada Trail through Collier Dams Park. That's just a few real brief examples. So I think the focus on communication is, rather than on the piece around enforcement, is really looking sort of, in a way, deputizing our residents or business owners to participate in the clearing of snow, recognizing that we can't do everything for everybody during these relatively rare events. We don't have the capacity, or I should say we have the capacity to do a certain level, which we attempt. I think the only other point is, again, just to point the focus to priority routes as far as emergency services and transit, not necessarily creating convenience for drivers or not. The roads and the focus are a 24-hour operation, whereas some of the vast number of city sidewalks that do get cleared by largely our Parks Department, is in the downtown core and in front of city facilities, are on an early day shift as opposed to a 24-hour operation. Largely that's due to safety for staff, but I think that covers some of my remarks. I probably said more than that you were interested in, but it was just really to provide the context to the report. There was a number of sort of very specific directions in the proposed motion, which I think Mr. LaBerge's presentation spoke to, and just wanted to provide a little bit of context and to reassure council that we're always looking for improvements, and certainly the big one is around communications. We'll try and, we've already got plans in the works to improve that. So I'll just leave it there. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to
Thank you, Mr. Sims. Before we get to questions, Ms. Berry would like to make.
Thank you, Chair. Just further to Mr. Sims' comments around communications, and I know he did say it's quadrupled, even prior to it quadrupling, I just want, in March, I asked for a summary of the communications around the snow event, because we had received some complaints back then regarding it. And a summary was provided by Ms. Sponagle. She works in the communications section and legislative services. There was a very comprehensive news release in December 11th, 2008, that was shared via social media as well, that did specifically articulate that property owners or occupants are required to remove snow and ice from sidewalks in front of their properties within 24 hours, so that pedestrians have a safe place to walk and can stay clear of traffic. So that communication went out. Then for news releases, there was one posted February 11th. There was a page created on February 11th on our website. There was another news release that went out on Friday, February 15th, right before the weekend, regarding reminders of all of this. On Facebook, there was 3 posts on February 8th, 3 posts on February 10th, 9 posts on February 11th, 7 posts on February 12th, 3 posts February 13th, 5 posts on February 14th, and another 3 on February 15th, all regarding the snow event. There was 2 videos created by the communications team. On Twitter, there was, again, 2, 3, 10, 6, 4, 5 posts on all of those same dates as I indicated before, as well as email correspondence. And on the Facebook, there was about 100 responses to comments that people were, individuals in the public were commenting on, and responses to those. And there was emails back and forth between the staff, as well as just Natalie Sponagle herself had 78 emails that was just in her Outlook that were responding to concerns and issues surrounding the snow event. And Mr. Al Britton and Mr. David Miles came and did a snow and ice control presentation to council in early 2018 as well. So can we improve communications? Yes, but there was significant communications done around that snow event, and we'll continue to strive to do better. So I just want to put that in.
Thank you, Ms. Berry. We have one question so far, Councillor Martin.
Thank you, Chair. So I agree that communications is one of the key components to trying to have a successful snow removal off our sidewalks. I'm wondering if communicating with all the neighborhood associations, what I would like to see when it comes to snow removal and the responsibility is asking not only what your city can do for you, but asking what you can do for your city. Because we need to work together on this. And so I think that people have to understand their responsibility. And I really put pressure on businesses because they want to be open. They should be really making sure that their sidewalks are clear along with their parking lots. Is it actually possible to plow a road? Because we did get an email that said when the snowplow had slowed down, there was less snow that was created on the sidewalk. Now, when you're plowing snow, it's got to go somewhere. So, is there any possibility for making there less snow on the sidewalks?
Mr. Chair, there's always that possibility, and we're struggling to balance the. We're hearing feedback. Is that?
Yes. Yes.
There's always that possibility, but we're balancing the initial response usually, which is hurry up and get things open, versus you're throwing snow too far and breaking fences, and we have those challenges as well. So it is a balance. Our staff are trained extensively, both Public Works and Parks point of view, to try and deal with balance, but also deal with that very frustrating condition where we fill in the marriage.
So if I may, if you were slowing it down, it would take longer, or it would need more manpower, and,
Again, there's a balance. We recognize we're not immune to the fact that we're creating headaches for people because we create them for ourselves too. And there is the possibility of pushing the snow a little bit further to clear some of the sidewalks in those very rare locations where you have a rollover,
Right.
usually residential. As long as there's no cars parked there and somebody hasn't put their garbage can out and so on and so forth. So there's a myriad of conditions that we encounter, but try and be respectful. But I just wanted to.
Thank you. And maybe somebody else knows, but I've heard, last year we heard about this Christmas Angels Snow Program, where people went out and they helped their neighbor who's too elderly, or et cetera, et cetera. Nanaimo is a fantastic city. We have one of the highest rates of volunteers in our city, et cetera. I think our citizens, we can all come together and we can make it better. Thank you.
Any further, Councillor Bonner?
Thank you. I'll be right up front, because we're all supposed to be honest here. This was not what I was expecting at all, in terms of report. And right off the bat, the problem I see with this is I don't have any options here. I'm not being given options as a council to say, if you choose this road, then you can do this, or if you choose this, then we won't be able to do this. All I'm basically being given is, here's what we did last year, and we're probably going to make it a little bit better in terms of our own properties, the city's properties. But I'm not seeing any major change here, and we do need a major change here, because I look at this similar to I look at bike lanes. We're building new bike lanes in this state not because we got so many bikes out there that they're bumping into each other, but because we have to build the infrastructure so that they will feel safe to use it. And this follows under the same line. If we're going to be if we get a 2-inch snowfall, and then we dump another 14 inches of snow on the sidewalk, we are creating a situation where the people who ordinarily use that sidewalk can no longer use it. And I think we need to come up with another option here. And I'm not expecting the city to be responsible for all 439 kilometers of sidewalks. But what I am expecting is that the city approach the business community and let them know that this is something that is a priority, because I'm looking at the policy 9302, and it's right there at the top. Number 3. Where the commercial properties are responsible for clearing their sidewalks. And I don't see anything in this report that's going to get them to change their mind. And with all due respect about Facebook posts, the head that runs our city and the head of the RDN, neither are on Facebook. So why would we expect all the commercial property owners to be on Facebook? There's a question of communications, and there's a question of effective communications. And I think my recommendations of the motion was quite clear in an effective communication policy that would help alleviate this, not by us doing more work, but by getting the property owners, commercial property owners, to know without a doubt, well ahead of the time when they book their snow removal contracts, that they had an obligation to make sure the sidewalks were clear, and if they weren't, then effective policy of enforcement was going to take place. And I don't see any of that, not even as an option here. Right, so that's my problem with this report. I appreciate the staff's gone to this work, but this does not address any of the concerns I think that we will have the minute we have another inch of snow on our roads.
Mr. Chair, if I can maybe address some of those comments before others do, it's just, and Mr. Rudolph may wish to chime in as well. I just, again, wanted to, we had this, this was referred to this committee for discussion. That was the intent of the report, is to provide that background. It wasn't, and to put it on this table for discussion, not necessarily options, or decisions necessarily. So to get some input from council on where do we want to go. The other point that I would make is that just to remind council that, or the committee, that our focus again is not on clearing roads for the convenience of the public. It's really for the opening up emergency routes, opening up transit routes. That's kind of the level service that we provide. And if we can continue, snow stops, we will continue providing winter driving conditions, not bare, dry roads, winter driving conditions. So this is a rare circumstance. It's, of course, council's prerogative to suggest that we change that approach, but this is, I would suggest, best practice in other communities.
And just one other thing.
We've got a list of 4 speakers. So
Okay, go ahead.
let's go down and then we'll get back to you. Councillor Armstrong.
Well, thank you. One of the issues I have with the report, and I think it's bared out by the previous legal opinion on this, is that you can't separate the commercial from the household. That's a big issue, and that would lead to a lot of problems. The other thing is, and it's mentioned in number 7, creating a policy around the high-level service, it holds you up to a lot of liability, which can be confirmed by talking to municipal insurance in BC. They will tell you that, but it does. So I think that's something we need to look at. I believe that the sidewalks all should be cleared. I know in my neighborhood, if somebody can't do it, we all do get together to do it. I think the campaign, I think we should start first with the campaign to businesses to try and get them to move and do this, because really the people that they lose is their customers, right? So they're the ones that are going to suffer the consequences. The only good thing about snow issues is a lot of times people do slow down, so it's a lot safer to be on the roads, even though we shouldn't be on the roads, but it is safer. But that's my big issue with this, is that we are, and if you look at the report we've got to be fair to all, and you're unfairly targeting businesses, and I think that would not stand a challenge. So that's my concern. You said that we're going to go after homeowners and businesses, fine, but even then, I don't think the enforcement is going to get you where you need to be, and we've already heard from our bylaws that they're stretched to the limit anyhow. So those are concerns I have around that motion. Thank you.
Before we get to Mayor Crowe, Mr. Ray.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to touch on Councillor Armstrong's point about MIA, the Municipal Insurance Association of BC, and the liability. So since 2007, I've coordinated claims against the city, liability claims against the city. And so I've been doing that for 12 years now. And the higher the policy set by the city, which the highest could be a council policy, the more weight it provides in a court challenge, either in our favor or against us. So we do experience a lot of trip and fall claims. If we were to set a policy at a council level and for some reason we were unable to adhere to it, it would harm us liability-wise in a court challenge.
Thank you, Ms. Gary. So next we have Mayor Crowe, followed by Councillor Brown, and then Councillor Marks.
Thank you very much, Chair. I must admit, I thought Councillor Bonner made an excellent point about Chair Thorpe and myself and our non-participation in Facebook, which illustrates the point very well, because his criticism was that it doesn't reach that many people. That was the implication, and we don't go on Facebook. So maybe that answers the question of itself, that Facebook is not the only method of communicating with people. But notwithstanding that vicious attack, I'm very proud of participating in Facebook, because that's exactly the kind of communication one gets on Facebook. But having said that aside, I think with great respect, we all know what the best solutions are, and that's, we don't get any snow, but that one's beyond our control, short of a great deal more prayer. Having said that, this is a temporary problem that occurs relatively rarely in our community. The issue is, how do we respond in a way that best promotes public safety? I think Councillor Armstrong has raised a number of issues around the legality of what could be demanded of commercial versus private residential owners. We then come back to the same problem. Even if the commercial enterprises in our community do comply with the bylaw fully and completely and ensure that their premises are cleared up, we'll still face the issue of fragmentation in terms of the access from the neighborhoods for people who will be walking along in front of sidewalks of, you know, the seniors who live in my neighborhood who tend to dominate now, who are often not in a position to shovel and don't feel rich enough to hire somebody. And even if they could, they're not available because they're all making money at somebody else's expense someplace. I mean, I think the solutions, in as far as they are reasonable and practical, are around an enhanced level of communication around this issue in preparation for the winter. And I don't, with great respect to Mr. Sims or staff, require a lengthy report to tell me that we could up the game in communications perhaps in terms of either advertising or a notice or whatever, or radio. There are ways to communicate with the public that the city regards this as a serious issue and explain why. Whether it's around the vulnerability of children going to school, as Ms. Thompson has pointed out, or seniors trying to make their way to their neighbor's house to check to see if their even more elderly neighbor is alive and well. I think those are the practical solutions. Because candidly, I must say, as a member of this council, looking and anticipating what we are going to see in terms of tax increases potentially for next year's budget, I'm not prepared to implement the kind of expense that may enable us as a council to have the kind of equipment available that Councillor Bonner used in Windsor to clear the sidewalks there, because with great respect, I think I can state this as a fairly well-known fact, I think Windsor gets a little more snow than beautiful Nanaimo. And so the question is, how much capital do we put in to deal with an issue that is a serious issue when it occurs, but relatively speaking is short-term as compared to the issue of cleaning out our parks every day to ensure that the people in the city can use them in a relatively safe manner. So I'm all for communication. In terms of a policy, then we're going to have to be very careful about it, because frankly, I have no desire to get us involved in a lawsuit to be a precedent, court-setting precedent. You just heard this morning just the cost of trying to get into a court injunction stage. Apart from upping the policy game perhaps and better communication, I don't expect staff to come up with some practical solution that doesn't involve significant expense. And I don't get the sense around this table we would have public support or support of council to provide the kind of equipment and people and contracts available to do this. I mean, there was a reason we used to make a joke in this province about Victoria having to worry about the snow when it fell, and it had their one snowplow to deal with it. It's because they can't make everything a priority. It just strikes me that we have to be reasonable in response to this problem.
Thank you, Mayor Crowe. Next we have Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair Turley. I'm tempted to say that we choose to clear snow from sidewalks in this decade and do other things too, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Oh, God. I thought it was the old man quote.
No. In all seriousness, I do agree with Mr. Plow, but I think we have to come to some sort of a compromise here, and I think a great first step would be a communication strategy to residents, to business owners. Councilor Martin's suggestion to neighborhood associations was a wonderful one. I agree our budgets are constraints. I think we do have a problem around snow getting plowed onto sidewalks, but hey, at least we have sidewalks in some areas, so that's a good thing as well. So I think a communication strategy would be a great first approach. I'm prepared to move that as a recommendation to go on to council, but staff prepare a communication strategy if the chair would be permitting that sort of thing at this point.
We have a seconder.
Yes. Look at it's got to be
We have Councillor Gilzo.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, for seconding.
Sorry.
Second.
You're still a speaker. You're still a speaker.
Sorry.
I made a lot of what I've lost it yet. So now we have a motion on the floor. If you could restate it for the benefit of everybody quickly, please.
Well, I didn't really have one crafted. That staff prepare a communication strategy for council's consideration around snow and ice removal that aims to educate citizens and businesses on the nature of our bylaws.
And inspire them.
If I may interrupt, Mr. Chair,
is there one
with the
in there?
indulgence of Councillor
A.
Sorry.
Brown, why not just vary A somewhat? Taking out the
I would take a look at these.
targeting businesses, just targeting everyone.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Councilor Bond's original.
Scurry, go ahead, please.
Is the motion going to be directed around just sidewalks, or is it going to be including roads, etc.?
Good question.
Votes?
In our communication strategy, is it just going to be specific to sidewalks?
Walk against traffic. No.
I would say I would prefer to limit the communication piece to sidewalks, but
It's your call, it's your motion.
yeah.
Your motion. The seconder, okay with just Councillor?
Yeah, no,
I knew that.
I'm good with the motion.
You're good with the motion, okay. Discussion on the motion, we have a motion, we have Councilor Hammond.
Thank you. So I'm in full support of communicating well during a snow event. I heard Ms. Gurry say that we had a really comprehensive plan during last year's snow event, and that didn't actually require a strategy. I'm concerned a little bit about staff capacity for, as what the mayor says, is a very rare event. I feel like we did a decent job last year. Our staff are stressed, and I don't think we need a strategy around this. I think, maybe preemptively. I'm not even sure if Ms. Faroki was employed at this time last year. I think that we don't need a strategy, we just need to understand that, okay, last year we maybe could have made improvements.
And Chair, just further to Councillor Hammond's point, we already are working on this year's communication strategy. There already has been meetings. Mr. Simmons, who can correct me, but wasn't there a meeting the other day? And a communication strategy is already underway for this year, as we do every year. I don't think all of council thinks it was an effective communication strategy, so we can obviously work on improving that, but it is already underway.
Councilor Armstrong.
Yeah, I'm in support of the communication strategy because I do think, like the mayor said, not everybody is on Facebook. Like, I think, a lot of people rely on that, and there's a very small number that are. I think it's important that stuff gets to the newspapers because a lot of people still do get their information from the newspapers. I think, maybe even if, and we talked about this before, it was talked about, when our tax assessment school, property tax assessment school, why aren't we including something like that in there? Remember, with the upcoming snow season, please ensure that you get your sidewalks cleared. Like, I think the more we emphasize that, the better it will be, because I don't think anybody deliberately chooses not to. I think some of it's laziness, absolutely no doubt. Some of it is cost factor. I know for me, like, I'm on sometimes 3 times a day trying to keep up with it, and our neighbors do the same, but not everybody is able to do that. So I think if we've got the communication out, that we're really strongly encouraging people to do that and use enforcement as your very last option, I think that's important. But I do think it can't hurt to remind people, myself, because some people do forget, especially because it is a not often happening thing. So I'm in favor of communication.
Ms. Gurry, did you?
Oh, I was just going to state, it doesn't just include online social media communications, not last year.
So it's not just Facebook?
Exactly.
No.
Will you be reassured by that, I hope?
The mayor does a radio play.
Okay, next we have Councilor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair. And so I'm speaking to this motion. I'm in favor of a communication strategy as well, but it also has to be a strategy that is well ahead of snow falling on the ground, so that everybody who needs to know about this bylaw is informed about this bylaw, because that is where the liability comes in. Not so much that we have a bylaw that we don't enforce, that if we do decide to enforce it, it has to be fair, and everyone has to have knowledge of the bylaw and the enforcement change. Because up until now, we haven't been enforcing it, so that's the policy, right? If snow falls, we don't enforce sidewalk clearing. If we decide to change that, all the people who are responsible for clearing their sidewalk need to know well ahead of time. And then we can protect ourselves from liability claims by saying we followed all the rules, right? So that's why it's rather important that we have a proper communication strategy, and let's review it in 6 months to see how it works. But sending out stuff the day the snow falls is not going to happen, because according to, and I agree with the mayor, which you must probe, is that
Don't see it on Facebook enough.
No, it's not so much as seeing on Facebook enough, is that when it snows, the snow plowers are already doing their contract work. And so if a company hasn't had an opportunity to write it in their contract, they're not going to get their sidewalks done, because they're busy doing other things. So this is why communications is key and early for the snow plows.
So I'm cognizant of the time. We're supposed to be out of here by 4 o'clock, and I've got about 6 of you still wanting to speak. So if you could keep your comments short and succinct. And the next one on the list is Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Most of what I want to say has been said, in particular by Councillor Armstrong. I just want to reiterate that it's not so much that I had a problem with last year's. I just thinking of our strategic plan, I think we can build on that work and do something much more comprehensive and hopefully change behavior.
Thank you. Councillor Martin.
Thank you. Making it quick, I'm in support of a communication strategy. I do believe we were doing our best, but I think that there's other things we can add in. I'd like to be that all the neighborhood associations are contacted by letter. And it was right here where I read it from staff about the Snow Angels campaign. And maybe, I don't know if we throw $1,000 to a neighborhood association that keeps their sidewalks the cleanest. But all of this is being very proactive in the fact that if we have this much in-depth conversation, there will be no snow this year.
That's a good point. Would that be
That's the way insurance works.
I'm going to change the order around a bit because of first-time speaker, Councillor Geselbrecht, and then followed by Councillor Hemmings.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the discussion on this. I think we are living in a town and historically where things have been run by vehicles. Our town is super spread out, and I think the message that we need to just say is like, this city does not forget about the pedestrian. This is a very small event with snow, and we don't have all the resources to clear all the sidewalks, but we're not forgetting about the pedestrian, and we're going to do what we can to improve the situation and then change that culture. And I think communications is really important about it. Like, I do walk. I walk down to City Hall, and I remember walking the snow thing, and there's a big sloping frozen snow, and you're kind of walking in the road, and yeah, it's a little bit irritating. It is only for like 10 days. It's not the end of the world, but I think that we can send the message out that it matters to us, and we're going to do the best that we can. And I appreciate what Mr. Sims, the idea is like we're identifying key pedestrian routes that we can plow when necessary. We've got the communications and short-term incentives. So thank you.
Councillor Hemmings, last word.
Thank you. I think we're confusing a bunch of issues. One is that snow events happen. How we deal with the snow is really up to Bill's department. I'm hearing we have a strategy around that, and that's based on best practices from other communities. We can always improve, of course we can. We have a motion on the floor for a communication strategy, which we've heard from staff is already in process. We have a communications manager who wasn't with us at this time or wasn't with us during the snow event last year, but who is in the back of the room probably taking notes that we want to hear. We want to go out to neighborhood associations. We want to be preemptive. We want to do things other than Facebook. So I'm not sure why we're talking about a formal strategy when staff are saying, we're on it, we've got it. They're hearing our feedback. So I'm just not sure what we're voting on. It's very confusing.
Can I council record?
Let's just gild the lily and vote on this one.
Yes, it's a council
Just really.
Okay, hang on a second. Just a minute. Councillor Clark.
Was Councillor Hemmings finished? Thank you. I thought I was on your list.
Sorry,
I will be brief. So yeah, I agree. I think we've sort of evolved this conversation into a place we didn't know it was going. I first of all think it's much better to ask people's cooperation and rely on their cooperation rather than threatening them with a fine, which is probably unenforceable anyway. So I'm pleased that we've moved in the direction of communicating. I tend to agree with, I think, what Councillor Hemmings said, and that is that we already try to do our best, and staff is hearing that we want to continue to improve our efforts through any venue, including that Facebook thing. I'm not sure that a motion or a new strategy is necessary. So I'm quite happy to rely on staff to continue their best efforts, to investigate best practice, and to do as good a job as they can with the resources they can to deal with any snow that we get and to communicate our expectations to the public. So,
Okay, let's vote on this. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Okay, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. Oh, hang on, did we have another item on the agenda before we get to this? No. We don't need it, okay, good. So we have in this order, Mr. Manners on 5D1.
He's already up there.
Floor is yours.
5D1.
Thank you, council members and staff. I had a series of questions, and in looking at the time, I'm going to make it really short, so I'm going to ask one, and that is regarding the first subject, and that was, I'm going to ask council members and/or staff, when will you act to separate bylaw enforcement from municipal enforcement and remove social issues to a separate department? That is what I believe Mr. LaBerge was asking for, because it's just too much.
Councillor Armstrong.
I think we're just hearing that, so I don't think we could even, myself, I'm not prepared to go there because I think we want to hear more from staff on those recommendations. I think it's a great, concept. I want to see what's happening in Kelowna. So for me, I'm in no position to make any decision on that until I get more information.
Okay, if you're not ready to make any more decision today, when can we expect the decision to be made?
Mr. Rudolph.
Mr. Chair, this is a bit of a conversation that's happening at the Health and Housing Task Force about the role of the city and the resourcing and what its position is in this whole subject matter. So then, when it's clear on that, then we could ascertain how we organize our resources to deal with it, how then we. So
Thank you.
It's a germane question. I think it's slightly premature.
Thank you. Okay, my second question was regarding the snow removal.
Yeah.
And as I've mentioned this council before in a past discussion, neighborhood groups, as Councillor Martman stated, is an awesome idea. I took it upon myself as a part of the Dover Community Association to go out and talk to the neighbors on the days that snow was on the ground, let them know that it was a city directive that they are required to remove their snow. And I'm happy to say that about 90% of them did. There was one property that didn't, and this year when the snow falls, I'm planning on going and talking to them again. So it's communication. And if the neighborhood groups have the support of the city, I think that would be a very good idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Next we have Ms. Thompson. That way everybody listening can hear you.
Thank you. I have, with respect to the first presentation on bylaw services, my question is around a BC Ombudsperson's report that recommended an enforcement policy. We heard a lot during this presentation about how enforcement can be inequitable, how enforcement causes conflict, about a lot of exceptions to rules, about old ladies' husbands dying and not being able to enforce bylaws. An enforcement policy, which is recommended by the Ombudsperson 3 years ago, is what helps take away the ambiguity in enforcing bylaws and makes it fair and consistent and systematic for everyone and makes it easier for bylaw enforcement officers. And so my question is, will the city be working on writing an overarching bylaw enforcement policy that will help support bylaw officers to do their jobs?
Councilor Brown.
I think it was a great point, and I think it helps staff, it helps the community, it helps council, it helps everyone. My hope is through agenda planning that once we have some of those additional information in bylaw around revenues, expenditures, comparables, that we can continue to have that discussion, and I hope that we will have that conversation around the general enforcement policy as well.
Thank you. My second question
Just
is on
before you go, is there any other comments on the first question? Go ahead, Mr. Brown.
I think it's a good question through the chair. If you look at the Ledge Services business plan that will be coming to you at the end of November, you'll see the whole concept of an update and refresh of our bylaws and policies is necessary across the organization. We don't dispute that. It's going to take time to do that, and this is nestled in that whole conversation, even fees and charges and a whole series of things. So it's just a matter of getting to the point where we can actually do that systematically and then establish priorities in the queue. So it's relevant, we're aware of it, we appreciate the proactive tone that's being taken on this whole thing, and we'll have more opportunity to unpack that as we work our way through business planning and other workshops with council.
Go ahead, Mr. Anybody else before I carry on?
So my second question is on the snow clearing issue of sidewalks, and of course, as a communicator, I see the importance of communications and a communication strategy. Despite the long list of communications went out last year, I think we saw that without enforcement, communications does not have a lot of impact. So I'm not actually certain that only communications will work. Carrot stick approach is usually the way to get at that. But nevertheless, if a communication strategy is done, I would like to know if, aside from or in addition to neighborhood associations, individual residents, that the communications policy also include business owners, commercial property owners, SD 68, and RDN Transit. All of those stakeholders have an important role to play in making sure that transit routes, bus stops, school zones are kept clear, not just residential property owners. They are not the most, egregious offenders in not keeping sidewalks clear. It's not neighborhood associations that need to pick up the slack. It's other major commercial property owners. So I'd like to know if that will be included in the strategy.
Go ahead, Councilor Martin.
Through you, I just assumed that when we were putting through for a communication strategy, that it naturally included all key stakeholders, businesses, etc., and we were, in addition, making sure that citizens and residents knew their.
Any other comments? Sorry, Ms. Green.
We will include. It will be included.
Okay, will be included. Thank you. And now we have the last question, and it's Ms. Andrews.
For all of you that don't know me, I'm Darcy Ambler. I'm one of the co-founders of Walk in Nanaimo. I have a question, but I was not allowed to answer a couple of questions that Wanda was asked. The first, in terms of communications, is I think the staff should be included, and I'm not criticizing the staff. I think that they're time pressed when they are cleaning the roads. I was the one that wrote the email that said that if the plow slows down, the snow is not going on the road. I have personally stood down the plow twice on 5th Street, a busy street, and when they slow down, the snow just goes to the edge of the road. So, in terms of transit, if you get off a bus and you can't walk on a sidewalk, it's no use anyway. As Mr. Sims was saying, that is a key priority in cleaning the roads. I got off the bus at Bevan, in front of Bevan Rec Center, about 8 days after the snowfall. The sidewalk was covered with snow and ice from the road being plowed onto it. The bus stop had about 6 feet of snow, and there was nowhere to walk. And I had an angel from the city came with a snowblower and walked me down to Labio. So, anyway, so long way of getting to my question. So directly following point 7, which is in the notes, where the issue of liability is raised, it is recommended that one of the approaches that is used be citizen engagement, and the example of snow angels was brought up. I worked in a counseling center that lost its insurance coverage for its volunteer counselors in Victoria when a major government body stopped or stepped back with its funding. These volunteers had to stop counseling until alternative coverage was found, and it was very difficult for them, and I was one of them because we counseled with our hearts. So how do the city staff recommend liability issues be dealt with if volunteers are used for snow clearing? And that there's also WorkSafe BC issues involved. And is this once again downloading onto the not-for-profit sector, something that governments should be picking up themselves?
Thank you, Chair. Regarding the volunteers and liability issues, there are programs through the Municipal Insurance Association of BC, our liability insurer, that will allow volunteers for those types of programs. However, it does require supervision and a bit of training by a City of Nanaimo staff in order for those programs and activities to take place. So there does have to be staff involvement in those, but then the liability issue is covered as long as there's that supervision and training.
And that's only if it's a city committee to do that. Like, I mean, any group can go out and do that themselves, so that's not our issue. If we're the ones that are forming that group to go do it, then it becomes an issue. But if myself and the mayor and Zenny want to go, the three of us, and clean up, there's no liability to the city.
Yeah.
And because we're doing that on our own.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer,
Yeah.
but if the city is making this a policy that
No, that's not,
they're...
we're not making it a policy.
Well, not a, okay,
Suggestion that
policy
people might
is a
wanna do
bad
that.
word,
Yeah.
but if the city is, I mean, I shovel my, well, sadly, he's no longer with us, my 90-year-old neighbor's sidewalk, and I do that voluntarily. I'm not going to sue him if
Yeah,
I
I
break
think that's
my...
what we're referring
But
to.
it's still, to me, downloading onto the public, something that if the city didn't plow the snow back onto the sidewalk, I know you'd have to go to another meeting.
Councilor Martin, sorry.
For clarification, when I spoke of volunteers, I was just meaning that I know that we have a great city with a lot of people that have good hearts. And I wasn't thinking of a not-for-profit picking this up by any means. I was thinking, as Councillor Armstrong demonstrated, I would volunteer to go help my neighbor, right? I understand what you're saying in regards to liability insurance. That's because counseling insurance is very difficult to get. Right, so, but I wasn't looking for not-for-profits or to download this to not-for-profits. I was looking at all us citizens helping each other, volunteering. That's all.
In a perfect world, I'd be with you.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you very much, Ms. Sandler. Motion to adjourn, Councilor Armstrong.
Not second that. I just want to make one quick comment. It's regarding the point of rare incidents. Yes, it's true, there are rare incidents of snowfall, which gets cleaned up off the streets quickly. But when it gets dumped on the sidewalks and we get a cold snap, it's 3 weeks of walking on ice. So it's rarely rare for the pedestrians.
Eric says to Windsor.
Windsor does a good job of cleaning the sidewalks.
Second, all in favor? Carried.
So, setting, seeing as how Karen and I are sitting here, don't expect me to round the show.